Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Take a slow breath, let your shoulders soften, and settle into wherever you happen to be resting tonight. There is nothing here that asks anything of you, and nowhere at all you need to be. Tonight we push open a low wooden door set into a stone wall on a cold and very still morning at the beginning of the year, and we step into a medieval Physic garden, a monastery garden walled on all four sides, laid out in narrow raised beds with paths of beaten earth between them, standing just now under a thin white frost, and we are not going to visit it for an hour and leave. We are going to stay in it for a whole year. 12 months, one season at a time, one bed at a time. From this first frozen morning through the sowing and the greening and the long hot harvest and the quiet turning of the soil, until the frost comes back around and the same seed chest is opened again on the same cold morning. There is one man in this garden with us for most of the year, and we do not know his name. He is the garden brother, the one the old plans of such places call the herbularius, the brother of herbs. He is somewhere between 30 and 60. He has a shed, a spade, a pruning knife, a watering pot of red earthenware, and a chest of seed, and those few things will come back again and again through everything we describe tonight, in 12 different lights. By the time the year closes, you will know his tools better than you know most of the objects in your own house. We will move slowly. There will be months where almost nothing happens, and those months matter as much as the busy ones. We will walk the beds in order. We will watch what comes up in them and what is cut from them, and we will follow what leaves the garden through the door at the far end, the one that opens into the infirmary. There is no need to remember any of this. Let the names of the plants drift past you like water over stones. If your eyes have closed before the frost has even lifted from the first bed, that is exactly as it should be, and there is nothing at all you will have missed. Settle in. Let us open the gate. The gate is small, and that is deliberate. A Physic garden in a medieval monastery was not entered through anything grand. The great doors of such a place were saved for the church, and this was only a working garden, so its door is a plain one, low enough that a tall man ducks a little going through, hung on 2 iron straps, with a latch worn smooth and pale on the side the hand always falls. It opens inward, which matters more than it sounds, because a door opening inward can be pushed against a drift of snow rather than blocked by one. In the coldest weeks of January, that small decision, made by whoever hung the door long before our gardener was born, saves him a great deal of trouble. Inside, on this first morning, the garden is almost entirely still. The frost has not lifted from the shaded side and will not lift there at all today. Every bed is edged, either with sawn planks pegged at the corners or with low woven wattle hurdles of hazel or willow, and the soil inside those edges stands a hand's breadth or more above the level of the path. The beds are raised because raised soil drains, and drains warms, and warm soil in a wet northern spring is the difference between a bed of seedlings and a bed of rot. They are also raised because a raised bed can be worked from the path on either side without a single foot ever standing on the growing soil, and a gardener who never treads his own beds keeps them light and open for years on end. The beds are narrow enough that a man of ordinary reach can touch the middle from either side without stretching. This is the single most consistent feature of every medieval garden plan that has come down to us, and it is not decoration. It is the shape a bed takes when the person who made it intends to weed it 1,000 times. Let us turn now to the walls, because the walls are the reason any of this is possible at all. The garden is enclosed on all 4 sides, and the enclosure does 4 separate jobs at once. The first and most obvious is that it keeps animals out. A monastery kept pigs and poultry, and often goats, and a single pig loose among the beds for one afternoon could undo a season's work in a way that would still be visible the following year. The second job is shelter. A stone wall 4 or 5 feet high breaks the wind for a distance of several times its own height on the leeward side, and in that broken air a tender plant that would be stripped and browned in open ground can hold its leaves through a hard spring. The third job is heat. A south-facing wall of stone takes in the low winter sun through the short bright hours and gives it back slowly through the night, so that the soil at its foot is measurably warmer than the soil 20 feet away, and the first green things of the year come up there first, every single year without fail. The fourth job of the wall is quieter and harder to put a number to. It marks the garden as a separate place. Inside it, the ordinary noise of the monastery is muffled. The cart yard, the kitchen, the bakehouse, the constant low business of a working community, all fall away a little, and what is left is the sound of a man's own spade and his own breathing. Later writers made a great deal of this, and made rather too much of it in places, but the plain physical fact underneath the poetry is simply that a wall absorbs sound. The garden brother did not need a symbol. He needed somewhere quiet to think about which bed to sow first. We turn now to how the beds are arranged, and to a single sheet of parchment that tells us more about that arrangement than anything else we possess. There survives in the Abbey Library of St. Gall, in what is now Switzerland, a very large drawing on 5 pieces of sewn parchment made in the early 9th century, showing the complete plan of an idealized monastery. It was almost certainly never built exactly as drawn. It seems instead to have been a considered proposal, a picture of how such a place ought to be laid out, sent from one house to another. And on that plan, drawn small and neat and labeled in a careful hand, are 3 separate gardens. The first is the kitchen garden, a rectangle of 18 long beds, set near the poultry and the gardener's own house, and its labels are the plain food plants of the north: onions, leeks, garlic, shallots, celery, parsley, chervil, lettuce, poppy, radish, beet, carrot, cabbage, dill, coriander, savory. This is the bed of the belly, the garden that fed the community day after day. The second is the orchard, which on that plan is also the burial ground, the trees standing in rows among the graves, so that the same ground gave both apples and rest. And the third, drawn beside the infirmary and the physician's house rather than beside the kitchen, is the herb garden itself, the herbularius. It has 16 beds, and each of the 16 is labeled with a single plant: lilies, roses, beans of the climbing kind, savory, costumary, fenugreek, rosemary, mint, sage, rue, flag iris, pennyroyal, watercress, cumin, lovage, fennel. 16 beds, 16 names, 1 plant to a bed. That last detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains a great deal about the garden we are standing in tonight. A Physic garden was not a mixed and pretty border. It was a set of separate holdings of a single kind of plant each, kept apart from one another, so that there could be no confusion when a leaf was cut in poor light for a purpose that mattered. A bed of sage was sage all the way across. A bed of rue was rue and nothing else. The gardener could send an assistant to the fourth bed on the left and be entirely certain what would come back. Our garden is not the St. Gall plan. Real gardens rarely matched the drawing, and by the time we are standing in one, it may have 20 beds or 30, and some of them may hold 2 or 3 plants where the demand was small. But the principle holds. Every bed knows what it is. Let us turn now to what those beds look like on this particular frozen morning, because most of them look like nothing at all. Roughly a third of the beds are simply bare brown soil, turned over rough in the autumn and left with the clods standing proud, so that the frost can get into them. This is deliberate, and it is one of the oldest pieces of practical knowledge in northern gardening. Water in the soil freezes, expands, and breaks the clods apart from the inside, and by March the same ground that was left in fist-sized lumps will crumble under a rake into something a seed can grow in. The frost does work that no tool in the shed can do. All the gardener has to do is get out of its way and let the cold have the winter. Another third of the beds hold plants that are visibly alive but doing nothing. Sage sits low and grey-green and slightly sullen. Rue holds its blue-green leaves through the whole winter and looks, if anything, better in January than it does in the heat of August. Rosemary, in a northern house, is either sheltered against the warm wall, or it is not there at all, because rosemary does not care for a wet, cold winter, and every gardener who has kept it knows the particular disappointment of finding a dead, grey bush in February where a good plant stood in November. Bay stands stiff and dark. Wormwood is a bundle of pale silvered stalks, cut back but not dug out. Lavender, where it grows this far north, is a low grey hummock with last year's flower stems still standing. The final third are the beds that have gone entirely underground. The whole of the lovage, all that towering green mass of high summer, is a patch of bare soil with a woody crown just at the surface. Angelica, elecampane, iris, comfrey, the plants grown for their roots, are all down below the frost line, doing slowly and invisibly the one thing a root plant does in winter, which is thicken. There is something quietly reassuring about a garden in this state, and any gardener in any century would recognize the feeling. Nothing can be lost today. Nothing needs water. Nothing is being eaten. The year has not started, and therefore the year has not yet gone wrong. We turn now to what our gardener actually does with a January day, since the beds themselves ask nothing of him. He does the indoor work. He mends. In a monastery, the brother who keeps the garden is not idle in winter simply because the garden is. And the rule that governed most of these houses was quite explicit, that idleness was the enemy of the soul, which in practice meant that every brother had something to be doing in every hour that was not given to prayer or sleep. So in January he sits in the workshop, and he makes and repairs the small things the garden will need in April. He weaves new hurdles for the bed edges from hazel rods cut in the winter coppice, bending the pliable stems in and out of upright stakes in the way that has not changed in 1,000 years. He sorts through last year's plant labels, which in most houses were simply flat slips of wood, and cuts new ones. He greases iron against rust with whatever fat the kitchen can spare. He goes through the seed chest, and we will come back to that chest properly in the autumn, but even in January he opens it and lifts out the little cloth bags and stoppered pots one at a time, and checks them for damp and for mice. And he reads, or has read to him, because a monastery gardener in a house of any size had access to books in a way that almost no village gardener ever did. We turn now to the last thing worth saying about the garden in this first month, which is that it is being watched. A monastery garden sat inside a community of men who saw one another every single day of their lives, and the state of the garden was visible to all of them. If the beds were untidy in January, if the whole house knew, if the wall was breached and had not been mended, the cellarer knew, and the cellarer in most houses held the practical purse. There was no anonymity in this work. The garden brothers' competence was on public display in a way that a modern gardener, working behind a private fence, would find slightly uncomfortable. And yet the reverse was also true. A garden that came through the winter well, that showed its rows straight, and its edges sound, and its wall in good repair, on the first mild morning of February, said something on the gardener's behalf that he never had to say himself. In a life largely without personal possessions or personal credit, that quiet public evidence of a job done properly was one of the very few things a man could point to and call his own work. Let us turn now from the frozen beds to the shed at the end of the path, because February begins with the opening of a door. The shed stands against the inside of the north wall, in the coldest and shadiest corner of the whole garden, which is exactly where a tool store belongs, since nothing in it wants sun. It is a lean-to of stone or timber with a low roof, and inside it is dark, and it smells of iron, old wood, dry earth, and the faint soreness of last year's sacking. Every gardener in every century knows this smell. It has not changed. On the wall hang the tools, and it is worth going along them one at a time, because these objects will be in our gardener's hands in nearly every scene we describe for the rest of the year. The spade first. A medieval spade is not the all-steel tool we would picture. Its blade is wood, usually oak or ash, cut in one piece with the shaft or socketed into it, and along the working edge is fitted a shoe of iron. A sheath of metal wrapped around the bottom of the wooden blade and riveted through. Iron was expensive and wood was not, so the metal went only where the tool actually met the ground. The shoe wore and was taken off and reforged by the smith, and put back on several times in the life of a single spade. Surviving examples pulled from waterlogged medieval ground show this repair pattern very clearly. The same wooden blade carrying a shoe far younger than itself. The handle at the top is usually a simple T of crosswise wood, or in some regions a D-shaped grip, and the shaft is shorter than a modern gardener would expect, which tells you that the medieval digging posture was more of a stoop than a stand. Next along the wall is the mattock, or in some accounts the pickaxe of the garden, a heavy head set crosswise on a shaft, with a broad blade on one side for chopping into hard ground, and sometimes a point or a narrow blade on the other for prizing stones. Where the spade slices, the mattock breaks. On heavy clay soil in early spring, when the ground is still half locked, the mattock does the work that the spade cannot yet do. Then the fork, which in the medieval garden was often literally that, a natural fork of hardwood with the tines shaped and sometimes tipped with iron, used for lifting and turning muck rather than for digging. Then the rake, the head a length of wood with pegs driven through it, its teeth of wood or iron. Then the hoe, in 2 or 3 shapes, some drawn towards the body and some pushed away, all of them there for the single endless task that occupies more of the gardener's summer than anything else, which is the killing of weeds. Then the smaller things, the dibber or setting stick, a simple shaped point of hard wood used to make a hole for a seedling or a bulb, worn glassy smooth at the tip from thousands of thrusts into soil. The bill hook, a curved blade for cutting hazel and trimming hedge. The pruning hook and the small pruning knife with its hooked point. The grafting knife, kept sharper than any of them. A bowl of coarse twine. A sieve of woven splints for sifting soil and cleaning seed. And in the corner, the baskets, several sizes of them, and the shallow flat ones that are for flowers and nothing else, because a rose petal crushed under the weight of other rose petals is worth less than one that is not. We turn now to the watering pot, which deserves its own moment. Medieval gardeners watered from a vessel that looks strange to a modern eye and is beautifully simple once you understand it. It is a bulbous jar of fired earthenware, about the size of a large jug, with a small hole at the top where a handle sits, and a cluster of many tiny holes pierced through the base. To fill it, the gardener does not pour water into it. He pushes the whole pot down into a butt or a trough and lets the water rise in through the holes in the bottom. Then he puts his thumb firmly over the single small hole at the top and lifts it out, and the water stays inside, held there by the pressure of the air. He carries it to the bed. He lifts his thumb, and the water comes out of the base in dozens of fine soft streams, a gentle rain rather than a hard pour, which is precisely what a bed of new seedlings needs, and precisely what a tipped bucket would destroy. Whole examples of these pots have been recovered from medieval sites, and they appear in manuscript illustrations often enough that we know they were entirely ordinary. Ours hangs on a peg by the door with a chip out of the rim. Let us turn now to the sharpening, because February is when the iron is put right. Every edge in the shed has spent the winter doing nothing, and every edge in the shed needs attention before the season starts. The gardener sits with a wet stone and works along each blade in turn, spitting on the stone or wetting it from a cup, drawing the metal against it in the long strokes that a man who has done this for 30 years does without looking. The pruning knife and the grafting knife take the most care and get the finest edge. The billhook takes a coarser one, because a billhook that is 2 fine chips on the first knot of hazel. The spade shoe is dressed with a file rather than a stone. What goes to the smith is what the gardener cannot fix. A cracked shoe, a mattock head loose on its shaft, a hoe worn back so far that its blade is a crescent. In a large monastery, there was a forge inside the walls and a brother or a hired man working it, and the garden's iron went across in a sack in the first weeks of the year, along with everyone else's. Let us turn now to the cold itself, and to what a medieval winter actually asked of a man working outdoors. He is wearing wool, and wool over wool. The habit of his order, whatever color it happens to be, with a second garment beneath it. And over both of them in the worst weather a heavy hooded cloak that in many houses had a specific name and was issued specifically for outdoor work. His feet are the problem, as they always are. Leather shoes over woolen hose, stuffed with hay or straw in the coldest weeks, and no true waterproofing at all beyond whatever grease has been worked into the leather. A gardener in January worked in short bursts and came inside, and the fire in the warming house, where such a room existed, was one of the few fires in the whole monastery that a brother was permitted to sit at during the day. His hands are worse. Medieval gloves existed, and working mittens of leather or heavy cloth are recorded, but fine work cannot be done in them, and so a great deal of the winter's mending was done with bare fingers in a cold room. The hands of a man who gardened all his life in this climate were, by every account we have, thickened and cracked and dark in the creases, with nails worn down flat, and they stayed that way from his 20s until he died. None of this was thought remarkable. It was simply January. We turn now to the pruning itself, which is the first outdoor work of the season, and the reason the knife was sharpened at all. The old rule, which is still the rule, is that woody plants are cut in the dormant season, after the worst of the cold has passed and before the sap rises. February in a northern climate is that narrow window. The gardener goes along the bay, the sage, the rue, the wormwood, the southernwood and the lavender, and takes each one back. Sage is cut hard, because sage left alone grows leggy and woody, and gives fewer leaves each year, and an old sage bush that has never been cut is a sprawling grey thing with all its green at the ends of long bare stems. Cut back into the young wood, it comes again thick from the base. Rue is trimmed rather than cut hard, and it is trimmed carefully, because the sap of rue on skin in sunlight raises a burn that can blister and can stay dark on the skin for weeks. Every gardener learns this once. February sunlight is weak enough that this is the safest month of the year to handle it. Wormwood and southernwood are taken back close to the old wood, and the trimmings are not thrown away. They go to the linen store and the wardrobe, laid among cloth against moth. And this small transfer of material from the garden to the linen cupboard happened in one form or another in nearly every household in Europe. The lavender is only tipped, never cut into the bare old wood, because lavender cut into the hard grey wood very often does not come back at all, and a man who has lost a lavender bush that way does not lose a second one. And the fruit in the orchard, if the orchard is his responsibility, as well as the herb beds, is pruned now too in the same weeks with the same knife. Let us turn now to the first flowers, which arrive in February, whether anyone is ready for them or not. At the foot of the warm wall, in the strip of ground that is always first, the snowdrops come up. They are almost certainly not native to Britain, and their early history in northern gardens is genuinely tangled, but by the later medieval centuries they are present, and they are strongly associated with the feast of Candlemas at the beginning of February, to the point that one of their old country names refers to that feast directly. Whether or not they were deliberately planted in our garden, they will be growing somewhere near the wall, white and small, and slightly ridiculous in a landscape that is otherwise entirely brown and grey. Behind them, tight to the stone, the first tips of the bulbs are showing. Not flowering, only showing, a green blade the length of a fingernail pushing up through soil, that was frozen solid a week ago. And this is the whole of February's promise. Not color, not scent, not harvest. Just the very first evidence, at the warmest foot of the warmest wall, that the year is going to happen again. The gardener notices it, in passing, on his way to the shed with a blunt hoe in his hand. He does not stop. There is a great deal of iron still to sharpen, but he notices it, and something in him settles a little, the way it settles in any gardener at the first green thing of the year, and he goes on to the shed and shuts the door behind him against the cold. We turn now to March, and to the question that every gardener in every century has had to answer without ever being certain of the answer, which is when to begin. Sowing too early loses the seed, sowing too late loses the season. And the medieval gardener had no thermometer, no printed almanac in his early centuries, no weather forecast of any kind, and no calendar hanging on a wall. What he had instead was the church, and the church gave him a year already divided into named days that everybody around him also knew by heart. This is one of the quiet pleasures of understanding how these people actually thought. When we imagine a monk planning his sowing, we are inclined to picture him consulting something like a diary. He was not. He was thinking in feasts. He knew that a certain job was done in the week before St. Gregory, and another in the days after the Annunciation, and another not until after the rogation processions had gone round the fields. The saints were the calendar. They were spoken aloud in church several times a day, in order, all year, so that every single member of the community carried the whole year's structure in his head, without any effort at all. Let us turn now to the particular days that mattered most in March. The Annunciation, on the 25th of March, was the great fixed point of the month, and for a very long stretch of English history, it was also the first day of the legal year. Lady Day, as it was called, marked the point at which contracts began, rents fell due, servants changed places, and accounts were closed and opened. For a gardener, it also sat right at the moment when the soil in most of Northern Europe becomes genuinely workable, and a great many old sowing sayings cluster around it. Earlier in the month came the feast of St. Gregory on the 12th, which in a wide belt of continental Europe was attached specifically to sowing. There is an old German saying that at St. Gregory the gardener goes to the garden, and the same day is tied in various regions to the sowing of onions, of peas, and of the first hardy seeds. Whether or not the saint had anything to do with it, the 12th of March is a genuinely reasonable date for the first sowing in much of Europe, and the saying survived because the practice worked. And then, movable and unpredictable, there is Easter, and behind Easter the whole of Lent, which shaped the kitchen more than the garden, but shaped the gardener's workload all the same, because a community eating no meat for 40 days is a community eating a great deal more of everything else, and much of that everything else came out of his beds. We turn now to the moon, and to a piece of medieval practice that is easy to dismiss and worth understanding properly. Alongside the saints, many gardeners kept an eye on the phase of the moon. The general rule, recorded across an enormous stretch of Europe, and in a great many forms, was that things which grow upward and are harvested above the ground are sown as the moon is waxing towards full, and things which grow downward and are harvested from below the ground are sown or lifted as the moon wanes. Modern testing has not found much in this. The reason it is worth understanding anyway is that it gave the year a rhythm finer than the seasons and coarser than the days, and it stopped a gardener from doing everything at once. A man who will only sow his carrots in a waning moon will not sow his carrots and his lettuce on the same afternoon, and that spreading out of the work across 3 or 4 separate visits to the same corner of the garden is, in purely practical terms, rather good gardening. The seed goes in over a fortnight rather than a morning, and if a hard frost takes the first sowing, there is a second one a week behind it that survives. There is a version of this in almost every traditional agriculture in the world, and it very often produces sensible spread out sowing for reasons the practitioners would explain quite differently. Let us turn now to the preparation of the seedbed, which is the real work of March and the least glamorous thing in this entire year. The bed our gardener sows first is one of the ones left in rough clods since autumn. He begins with the rake. The frost has already done most of the work, and where in November the surface was a field of hard fists of clay, in March those same clods collapse into crumbs under a few passes of the wooden teeth. He works down the bed and back, breaking, leveling, drawing the larger stones to the edge and lifting them out by hand into a basket. Stones came out of medieval garden beds every single year, and they still do, because ground that is worked and frozen brings new ones up from below forever. Then he treads, not on the bed itself, but along the edges where the wattle has slumped, firming the sides back, and then he rakes again, and this second raking is the one that matters, because what he is making is a surface fine enough that a seed the size of a pinhead can sit in contact with soil on all sides, rather than falling into an air pocket between 2 lumps and drying out there. Gardening writers of the later centuries called this a fine tilth, and made rather a fuss about it. The medieval gardener had no such phrase. He simply raked until the bed looked right, and knew what right looked like because he had seen it several hundred times. We turn now to the sowing itself. The seed comes out of the chest in the workshop, from small linen bags and stoppered pots, and it is carried out in a shallow bowl or a fold of cloth. Fine seed is mixed with dry sand or sifted soil before sowing, which is one of the oldest tricks in the craft, because a seed the size of dust cannot be spread evenly by a human hand, but a handful of sand with seed mixed into it can. He sows broadcast for some things, and in drills for others. Broadcast means simply casting the seed with a swing of the hand across the surface of the bed, and then raking it lightly in. And it suits anything that will be grown thickly and cut young. For a drill he draws a shallow furrow with the edge of the hoe, or with a stick, walking backwards down the bed, and lays the seed along it, and closes it with the back of the rake. For the larger seeds, and for anything being set individually, out comes the dibber, that smooth pointed length of hard wood, and he makes his hole, drops the seed or sets the small plant, and firms it with 2 fingers. Everything is sown too thickly. This is not a mistake, it is a policy. Germination in a hand-saved, hand-stored, unwashed and untested seed lot was unpredictable. And the only insurance against a bare bed was to put in more seed than could possibly be needed, and thin the survivors later. A gardener who sowed exactly the right amount of seed and lost half of it to damp or mice or a cold week had an empty bed, and no second chance until the following year. Let us turn now to what actually goes in during these weeks, bed by bed. The hardy seeds go first, in the first workable week. Onions, which in the medieval north were grown from seed far more often than from the sets a modern gardener would use. Leeks, which are sown thickly in a nursery bed and lifted and replanted much later in the season. Parsley, which is sown early because parsley is slow and famously erratic in coming up. So slow that a whole family of folk sayings grew up to explain the delay, most of them involving the seed making a journey somewhere and back before it consents to sprout. Then the pot herbs and the salad things. Chervil, which comes fast and is worth sowing several times over. Sorrel, sharp and lemony, and one of the very first green things a medieval kitchen could actually use. Lettuce, which existed in medieval gardens in forms rather looser and coarser than ours. Cress, radish, quickest of all, then the umbellifers for seed and for root, dill, coriander, caraway, fennel, which in most gardens is a permanent plant rather than an annual one, but which is sown fresh where a bed has failed. Carrots, in their medieval colors, which were more often purple, red, yellow and white than the deep orange we now think of as the only possible carrot, and then the things sown for medicine specifically, in the beds nearest the infirmary end of the garden. Poppy, for the seed heads. Borage, marigold, which will flower until the frosts and be gathered 100 times. Clary, rocket, hyssop and savory and thyme, which are half woody and are as often propagated from a piece of an old plant as from seed. We turn now to the parts of the garden that are not sown at all, because a great deal of a Physic garden was permanent. The rue does not need sowing. It is there, and it was there 10 years ago. The sage bed is the same sage bed, cut back last month, thickening again from the base. The lovage crown is waking. The comfrey is sending up its first rough hairy leaves. The elecampane is a rosette of enormous soft, grey-green leaves like a giant's plantain. The iris rhizomes are swelling at the surface. The mint, which is the great colonist of every garden ever made, is already pushing runners under the edging boards into the path. And one of the gardener's regular March jobs is to go along that edge with a knife and cut them off, because a mint bed left alone for 4 years is a mint garden. This is the quiet fact about a Physic garden that a modern reader can miss. Most of what it grew, it already had. The sowing of March adds to a standing collection. It does not create one. Some of the plants in these beds were older than the gardener, and a few of them were older than anyone in the house. Let us turn now to the last thing March asks, which is watchfulness. The frosts are not over. They are in some ways more dangerous now than in January, because now there is something to lose. A clear still night at the end of March, with the sky open and the stars very sharp, can take the tips off everything that has come through, and a gardener learns to read that sky in the last hour before compline, and to go out afterwards with whatever he has to cover the most tender bed. Straw, old sacking, cut bracken, hurdles laid flat across the bed and weighted. And in the mornings he goes out early, before the sun can reach a frosted leaf, because the old knowledge held, correctly as it happens, that a frozen plant thawed slowly in shade suffers far less than one struck by direct sun while still frozen. He walks the beds. He looks. Almost nothing is up yet. He goes into terse with cold hands, and a fair idea of what he will do tomorrow, which is more or less the same as what he did today. Let us turn now to April, and to the fortnight in which the garden stops being a plan and becomes a place. The change is not dramatic, and it is not a single day. It is simply that at some point in the first half of April, a man walking the paths finds that he can no longer see the whole surface of the beds. Green has come up through the brown, unevenly, in rows and patches and blank spaces. And from this point until October, the garden will never be empty again. The first thing he does about it is nothing. Seedlings that have just come through are left entirely alone for a week or two. Because the roots are still shallow, the stems will not tolerate handling, and any weeding done too early pulls up as much of what was sown as of what was not. Then, when the seedlings have 2 true leaves above the first pair, the real work of April begins, and it has 2 halves, thinning and weeding, and they are done at the same time on the same knees. We turn now to thinning, which is a strange and slightly melancholy job that every gardener knows. Because everything was sown thickly, everything now comes up thickly, and a bed of carrot seedlings standing shoulder to shoulder will produce a bed of thin, bitter, useless roots. So the gardener kneels and pulls out the majority of what he grew, leaving 1 plant where 5 came up. There is no skill in this beyond patience and a willingness to be ruthless. But it is slow, and it is done bent over at a distance of a hand's breadth from the soil, hour after hour, and it is the single most common posture in which a medieval gardener appears in manuscript illustration, not standing heroically with a spade, kneeling hunched, working with his fingers. The thinnings are not wasted. Leek and onion thinnings go to the kitchen. Lettuce and cress thinnings are a salad. Some things transplant and are lifted with a dibber and moved to fill the gaps at the far end of the bed where the seed failed, and watered in immediately. Let us turn now to the weeds, and to a fact that surprises people when they first meet it, which is how much of the medieval gardener's year went on this one endless task. The weeds of a medieval garden were the same weeds we have now: chickweed, which comes early and forms a mat; groundsel, which sets seed absurdly fast and can go from seedling to seeding in a few weeks; fat hen, shepherd's purse, sow thistle, dock, couch grass, which is the true enemy, spreading underground by white brittle runners that snap when pulled so that every fragment left behind becomes a new plant; and nettles everywhere, on any ground that has ever been enriched. The tools are the hoe and the hand. The hoe is used on a dry day, drawn through the surface to cut the weed off at the neck and leave it lying to shrivel in the sun. And a gardener who hoes on a wet day simply transplants his weeds. The hand is used in the rows themselves, where a hoe cannot go without damage. Walafrid Strabo, a 9th century monk on the island of Rykino in Lake Constance, wrote a poem about his own small garden, and one of the most human things in it is his account of exactly this fight. He describes his plot as choked, the soil ruined by the roots of nettles, and the labor of getting it back, breaking the ground and lifting the roots and carrying them out. He was writing verse for other monks to read, and he still could not resist complaining about his nettles. It is a very small piece of evidence, and it is worth a great deal, because it tells us that the experience of standing in a garden and feeling slightly defeated by weeds is exactly as old as gardens. We turn now to the watering, which begins in earnest this month. Newly germinated seedlings and freshly transplanted plants need water in a way that established plants do not, and April in a dry spring can kill more of the year's work than any frost. The water comes from a butt or a stone trove or a well, or, in the better appointed houses, from a channel of running water led in from a spring, because monastic communities were unusually good at water engineering and often had a piped supply that no ordinary village possessed. And out comes the earthenware pot with its thumb hole, pushed under the surface to fill, thumb down, lifted, carried, thumb lifted, and that fine soft rain over the seedlings. He waters in the evening, after the heat, because water given at midday in April sits on a leaf and is lost, and he waters the soil rather than the plant wherever he can. Both of these things are still exactly what a gardener is told to do. We turn now to the things that eat a garden in April, because a seedling is food for a great many creatures. Birds first, and above all the pigeons, which will strip a bed of young greens to the stalk in a morning, and which were a genuine and constant nuisance in a world where somebody in the district almost certainly kept a dovercoat and was entitled to. The countermeasures were what they have always been: netting where net could be had, threads strung across a bed, bright rags, clappers and rattles worked by hand, and in some places a boy employed to make noise. Slugs and snails second, worst in a wet spring, worst of all at night, and the answer was to go out after dark with a lantern and pick them off by hand into a pot, which is a job that sounds absurd, and is still, honestly, one of the most effective things anybody has ever found. Mice third, which take newly sown peas and beans out of the ground almost as fast as they are put in. And the household's own animals fourth, because a hen through a gap in a hedge will scratch a seed bed to pieces in 10 minutes, purely for the pleasure of it. And the gardener's relationship with whoever kept the poultry was, in a great many houses across a great many centuries, a slightly strained one. Let us turn now to the bees who wake this month. Nearly every monastery of any size kept bees, and kept them for two reasons that had nothing to do with one another. The honey was food, and, more importantly for us, it was medicine, the base of every syrup and electuary, and sweetened draught the infirmary made. And the wax was light. The church required candles of beeswax, specifically for the altar, in quantities that were substantial, and a house that could not produce its own wax had to buy it. The hives are skeps, domes of coiled straw bound with bramble, set in a row on a bench, or in recesses built into a south-facing wall. In April they begin to come alive, and the gardener, or the brother who keeps the bees, where that was a separate charge, watches the entrances for the first strong flights, and for the pollen coming in on the legs of returning workers, which is the oldest and still the best sign that there are young being fed inside. The garden feeds them. Rosemary, where it survives, flowers early. The willows outside the wall carry catkins. Then the fruit blossom in the orchard. And by the end of the month the borage and the comfrey begin, and comfrey and flower is a bumblebee's whole world. We turn now to the last week of April, and to the way the garden looks at the end of it. The beds are green but thin. The paths have been swept. The wattle edges are all standing. The seedlings are in rows that are visibly rows. The first cutting of chervil and sorrel and cress has already gone to the kitchen. Nothing yet is ready in any serious quantity, and the store of dried herbs in the loft from last year is at its very lowest point of the entire 12 months, scraped down to the last brittle stems and the dust in the bottom of the sacks. This is the pinch. The old crop is finished, and the new crop is not ready, and every household in medieval Europe, from the poorest cottage to the largest abbey, went through some version of it every spring. In the kitchen it was felt as hunger. In the infirmary it was felt as a cupboard with very little left in it, and an infirmary making do with what he had, which was frequently not the thing he wanted. The gardener knows this, and it is why he pushes so hard in April. Every week earlier that the first real cutting comes in is a week the infirmary is not making do. And so he kneels in the path, in the low evening light, thinning carrots one by one, with a basket beside him and his knees aching, and the bees going home over the wall behind him. And it is entirely ordinary, and it is the most useful thing anybody in the whole monastery will do that day. Let us turn now to May, and to the only month of the year in which a medieval garden gives more than it asks. Everything grows at once. The soil is warm, the light is long, the rain in most northern springs is still reliable, and nothing has yet been exhausted by heat. A bed that was a thin scatter of seedlings at the end of April closes over entirely in the first fortnight of May, and the gardener who spent March looking at bare brown earth now cannot see the earth at all. The change in his day is total. He stops preparing and starts cutting. And from this point until the end of September, he will be carrying something out of the garden nearly every day. We turn now to what the kitchen takes first. The pot herbs come in by the basket. Sorrel and chervil and parsley, cut with a knife an inch above the crown so that the plant comes again. Young nettle tops, which sound like a joke until you understand that a nettle taken in the first weeks of growth is a genuinely good green and was eaten across the whole of Europe as one of the first fresh foods of the year. Alexander's, that tall celery-scented plant of old walls and monastic sites, which was a standard medieval pot herb, and only fell out of use much later when celery took its place. Young leaves of orach and fat hen, and good King Henry, plants that a modern gardener weeds out, and a medieval one grew on purpose. There is a whole category here that the modern kitchen has forgotten entirely, and it is worth naming plainly. A great many things we now think of as weeds were, in the medieval year, the first green food after a winter of stored roots and salted meat and dried peas, and they were welcomed accordingly. Let us turn now to what the infirmary takes, because May is when the infirmary stops making do. Through the winter, the infirmary worked from the dried store, and dried herbs are perfectly serviceable, but they are not the same. In May, the infirmary can send down to the garden and ask for something fresh and get it. He asks first for the wound herbs, because they are the ones most obviously better fresh. Plantain leaf, that flat-ribbed rosette in every path, bruised and laid directly on a cut or a sting. Yarrow, feathery and sharp-scented, with an old reputation for stopping bleeding that runs back through so many centuries and so many languages that it is one of the most consistently recorded plant uses in Europe. Self-heal, small and purple and lipped, whose names in half a dozen languages all mean roughly the same optimistic thing. Woundwort, comfrey leaf for bruises and for the long slow soreness after a fall. He asks for the cooling things. Violet leaves and flowers, for a syrup that was one of the standard soothing preparations of medieval medicine. Sorrel, for feverish thirst. Lettuce, which the old books treated as genuinely medicinal and cooling, rather than merely as a salad. And he asks for the bitter tonics, because spring was traditionally the season for clearing and cleansing, and the old physiology held that the sluggish, thickened humours of winter needed shifting. Wormwood, dandelion, agrimony, ground ivy, whether the underlying theory holds together or not, a household that ate a great deal of bitter green leaf after a winter of stored food was, incidentally, doing itself some good. We turn now to the Rogation days, which fall in May, and which took the whole community out of doors. In the 3 days before Ascension, and on the feast of Saint Mark in April, medieval parishes and monasteries walked their boundaries in procession, with a cross carried in front, chanting a litany, stopping at particular trees and stones and corners along the way. The purpose was a blessing on the growing crops, and the practical side effect, entirely understood at the time, was that the boundary of the land was walked and confirmed and remembered by everybody present, including the young, who in some places were deliberately and memorably made to remember a particular boundary stone. For our gardener, this is one of the very few days in the year when he is out beyond his own wall in company, walking slowly across fields he does not tend, past hedges and ditches and other people's crops, with the whole house around him and the litany going on. He notices the state of the hedgerows because he cannot help it. He notes where the elder is heavy with bud because he will want the flowers of it within the month, and where the hawthorn stands, and whether the field beyond the mill is wet. Let us turn now to the dew, and to one of the loveliest small beliefs of the medieval calendar. The dew of May, and specifically of the first morning of May, held a reputation across an enormous stretch of Europe. It was gathered on cloths from the grass before sunrise and wrung out into bottles. And it was kept as a wash for the eyes, for the skin, for freckles and blemishes, and it was thought to carry a freshness and a virtue that no other water of the year possessed. Young women rose before dawn to wash their faces in it, and the custom is recorded in so many separate regions and so many separate centuries that it clearly ran very deep. In a monastery it took a plainer form, and the collected water was likely to be used for the eyes of the sick rather than for anybody's complexion. But the underlying idea is the same, and the underlying idea is one of the gentlest in the whole of folk medicine, that the world is briefly at its cleanest in the hour before the sun comes up, and that a person can take a little of that cleanness and keep it in a bottle. We turn now to the flowery mead, and to the fact that a Physic garden was not only useful. Beyond the working beds, in many monastic grounds, there was grass, not a lawn in our sense, but a piece of rough sward left long and studded with small flowers, and the medieval word for it was a mead or a meadow, and it appears again and again in the illustrations of the period, thick with daisies and violets and primroses and speedwell and clover. At the edge of such a piece of grass there was often a turf seat, which is exactly what it sounds like, a low bench built of stone or brick or timber, filled with soil and turfed over on the top, so that the seat itself was living grass and sometimes chamomile, which releases its scent when it is sat upon. These were real and they were common. They appear in manuscript after manuscript, and modern reconstructions of medieval gardens build them because we know what they looked like in some detail. Whether the working brother of the herb garden ever sat on his own turf seat in the middle of a working morning is another question. But the infirmary garden in particular was understood to be for the sick as well as for the medicine, and a convalescent brother sent out to sit in the open air among the herbs, and the bees was receiving, in the understanding of the time, a genuine part of his treatment. The idea that a quiet green enclosure does something for a person who is unwell is not a modern discovery. It was built into the plan of the buildings. Let us turn now to the end of May and to the roses, which are beginning. Along one side of the garden, in their own bed as the old plans specify, the roses have been in leaf since March and in bud for a fortnight, and in the last days of the month, the first of them open. They are not our roses. A medieval rose is a species or a very old cultivated form, and the two that matter most for our purposes are the apothecary's rose, deep pink to red, semi-double, with a strong scent that holds even when the petals are dried, and the damask, paler and more heavily perfumed and later. The apothecary's rose earned its name honestly. It was the rose grown specifically for medicine, above all in the town of Provence in France, which became a genuine center of a rose-based trade producing dried petals, conserves, syrups and powders that traveled a considerable distance. That trade belongs mostly to the later medieval centuries, but the plant itself and its reputation were established long before, and so the gardener stands at the end of the rose bed on the last evening of May, with the light going, looking at a row of tight red buds and perhaps 3 opened flowers, and he is doing arithmetic, because everything about the next 4 weeks depends on the roses, and the roses will not wait. We turn now to June, and to the harvest that gave the whole year its scent. The rose bed is the busiest single piece of ground in the Physic garden, and it is busy for a short and unforgiving window. A rose is worth picking on the day it opens, and for perhaps a day after. Before that, the petals are locked in the bud, and the scent is not developed. After that, the petals brown at the edges, the scent flattens, and the flower begins to shed on its own. There is no storing an unpicked rose. So for something between 2 and 4 weeks, depending on the season and the variety, the gardener picks roses every single morning. Let us turn now to the hour, because the hour matters more here than for any other plant in the garden. Roses are picked early, not at first light exactly, but in the hour after the dew has dried and before the sun has any real heat in it, which in June in the north is somewhere between the offices of prime and terce. The reason is that the aromatic oil in the petal is volatile. It leaves. A rose standing in full sun at noon has given a great deal of its scent to the air, and what is left in the petal is measurably less than what was there 4 hours earlier. Every traditional rose-growing region in the world that still harvests for oil or for water picks in exactly this window, and has done for as long as anybody has records. The medieval gardener did not know about volatile oils. He knew that roses picked early made better rose water, because he had made rose water from roses picked late, and it was not as good. We turn now to the picking itself. He does not cut. He picks with his fingers, taking the flower just behind the head and pulling it free, and he drops it into a shallow basket. The basket is shallow for the reason we noted back in February, which is that petals crush. A deep basket of roses is a basket in which the bottom third is bruised brown by the time it reaches the workshop, and bruised petals go off fast and taint the whole batch. He fills basket after basket. The volume of it is greater than anyone who has not done it would expect. Rose water and rose oil are made in ratios that seem almost absurd. And while a monastery still house was working on nothing like the scale of a commercial industry, even a modest run of rose water swallows an amount of flower that takes a long morning to gather. His hands are scratched. Thorns are not optional. By the third week of June, the backs of both his hands are a map of small healed and half-healed scratches, and he takes no particular notice of them. Let us turn now to what happens to the roses that are not distilled, because a great deal of the crop never went near a still at all. Some were dried. Petals spread thin on cloths or trays in the drying loft, turned once or twice a day, and brought down when they were crisp and stored in stoppered pots away from the light. Dried rose petals were an ingredient in a very large number of medieval preparations, powders and electuaries and sweet bags and strewing mixtures, and they kept their scent for a surprisingly long time if they were dried fast and stored dark. Some were made into a conserve. Conserve of roses is one of the most frequently mentioned preparations in the whole of medieval and early modern household medicine, and the method is beautifully simple. Fresh petals, the white heels at the base pinched off because they are bitter, pounded in a mortar with sugar or with honey until the whole becomes a thick fragrant paste, and potted. It keeps for a year or more. It tastes of roses in the middle of winter, and it was given for coughs, for weakness, for a low mood, and to sick people who could not be persuaded to eat anything else. Some were made into a syrup, which is the same idea in liquid form, and syrup of roses appears in medical texts across centuries as a mild and gentle thing suitable for children and for the very weak. And some, in a monastery specifically, went to the church. Roses appear in the liturgy and in the decoration of altars at particular feasts, and a house with a good rosebed sent flowers up to the sacrist as a matter of course. We turn now to the other June flowers, because the gardener is not only picking roses. The elder is in flower now, along the outside of the wall, and in the hedge beyond it, great flat creamy plates of tiny blossom, with a scent that people either love or find slightly rank. Elderflowers were gathered in quantity for cooling drinks, for a wash for the eyes and the skin, and for infusions given in fevers, and the whole tree carried a weight of folklore that made cutting it a matter of some ceremony in many regions. The lime trees, where there were any, come into flower at the very end of the month, and lime flowers make one of the gentlest of all the old calming infusions. The chamomile is beginning, and chamomile will now flower continuously for months and be picked over and over. Borage is in flower, that clear blue star, and borage was believed to lift the spirits, a claim repeated so cheerfully and so often in the old books that it became almost a proverb. Marigold is opening and will not stop until the frost, and in among all of it, the first of the true summer weeds are coming through the paths, and there is never quite enough time. We turn now to the water, which in June becomes a daily obligation rather than an occasional kindness. A June garden in a dry week loses a great deal of water through its own leaves, and the beds that are fullest lose the most. The gardener's morning and his evening are both bracketed by carrying. Up from the trough, along the path, thumb over the hole, out over the bed, back to the trough. A monastery with piped water led in from a spring made this vastly easier, and the great houses of the Cistercian order, in particular, built conduits and cisterns, and settling tanks of real sophistication, so that water arrived where it was wanted rather than being fetched from where it happened to be. Most houses were not so fortunate. Most had a well, or a stone trough fed from a roof, or a stretch of stream diverted along the boundary, and most watering was done by hand from a pot that held perhaps 2 gallons. He waters selectively, which is the only sane approach. The seed beds get water. The newly transplanted leeks get water. The shallow-rooted salad things get water. The established woody herbs get nothing at all, and are better for it, because sage and thyme and rosemary and lavender all come from dry stony country, and a plant of that kind kept generously watered in rich soil grows soft, floppy, weakly scented and short-lived. This is one of the clearest cases in the whole garden where the correct treatment is to withhold care, and it is a lesson that every gardener has to learn against instinct. He also mulches, though he would not use the word. Cut bracken, straw from the barn floor, spent brewing grains, old leaf mowed from the corner behind the shed, laid along the rows to hold the moisture in and keep the surface from baking to a crust. And he weeds still and always, because a weed in June growing beside a watered seedling is drinking the water that the seedling was given. Let us turn now to the evening of a June day, and to what the garden is actually like at the end of it. The heat has gone out of the air. The scent of the rose bed, which was thin at midday because the day took it, comes back in the cooling evening and hangs over that end of the garden in a way that a person who has only ever met roses, one at a time, would find hard to credit. The bees have gone in. The paths are swept because the gardener sweeps them at the end of every day in the picking season, since fallen petals underfoot go slammy and stain the stone. There are baskets stacked by the door of the workshop for tomorrow. There is a smell of steam and roses from inside it that has not gone yet and will not have gone by morning. And the gardener stands for a moment at the low gate before he goes in to compline. In a garden that is at its absolute fullest and most fragrant and most demanding, with a fortnight of exactly this ahead of him, and he is, in the plainest sense, tired and content at the same time. Let us turn now to the still house, which is where the roses go. It is a small building, or in a lesser house, simply a corner of the workshop, and it has 3 things that the rest of the monastery does not have gathered in one place. A hearth that can be kept at a low and steady heat for many hours, a supply of water close at hand, and a set of vessels of glass or copper, or glazed earthenware that are worth more than anything else in the gardener's care. The room is warm and damp, and smells of steam and flowers, and in the last week of June it smells of very little else. We turn now to the equipment itself, and to the strange and rather beautiful object at the center of it. The still is made of 2 or 3 parts. At the bottom sits a rounded vessel, the body, which holds the material and the water. Over it sits a domed head, and the medieval word for that head is the alembic, from an Arabic term that itself came from a Greek one, which tells you a great deal about the route by which this craft reached northern Europe. The dome has a channel running around its inner rim and a spout leading out of one side. And out of that spout runs a tube, sometimes long and sometimes short, that leads down into a receiving vessel. The whole of the thing works on a single, very simple principle. Heat the water and the flowers in the body. Steam rises, carrying with it the volatile fragrant substance out of the petals. The steam meets the cooler inner surface of the dome, condenses there into droplets, and those droplets run down the inside of the dome into the collecting channel at its rim, and out through the spout, and down the tube, and drip into the receiver as a clear liquid that smells overwhelmingly of roses. That is all a still is. A hot place, a cold place, and a slope between them. Let us turn now to the heat, which is the part that takes the skill. The great enemy of distillation is too much fire. A rapid boil drives the steam through so fast that it does not condense cleanly, throws over material that should have stayed behind, and gives a product that is cloudy, that smells slightly cooked, and that will not keep. The old texts are entirely clear about this and say so repeatedly in various ways. The fire must be gentle. The fire must be even. The fire must be tended. The commonest way of achieving that gentleness was to take the flame away from the glass altogether and put water in between. The vessel sits in a larger vessel of water, and the water is heated, and the water cannot get hotter than boiling however hard the fire is pushed. So the material inside is held at a steady, safe temperature. This arrangement has a name in the old literature that has never really gone away: the Bath of Mary, and cooks still use the idea today, under a French version of the same phrase, without any notion of where it came from. There are gentler versions still: a vessel buried in warm damp dung, which sounds unappealing and works perfectly well, holding a very low steady heat for days. A vessel set in warm sand, which gives a hotter and drier heat for materials that need it. A vessel simply set in the sun. So the gardener, or more often a brother whose particular charge this is, sits with the fire for hours. He feeds it small. He watches the drip at the end of the tube, and he judges the pace by it. Too fast, and he draws the fire back. Too slow, and he adds a little. The drip should be steady and unhurried, and a good run is measured in half a day. We turn now to where this craft came from, because it did not begin in a monastery in northern Europe. Distillation is old, and the distillation of fragrant waters, in particular, has a long history in the Islamic world, where rose water was produced on a serious scale and traded very widely. The equipment, the vocabulary, and much of the theory came into Latin Europe through translation, largely through the schools of southern Italy and Spain in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. And the word alembic sitting in the middle of an English sentence tonight is a small survival of that journey. By the later medieval centuries, distilling was thoroughly at home in European religious houses and in the households of the wealthy, and the still room became a standard part of a great house, kept by the mistress of the household or by a servant under her, producing the flavored waters, cordials, and simple medicines that the household needed. That is a later development than the century of our garden, but the line runs directly from one to the other. And the still room of an English manor in the 16th century is doing something a monastery had been doing for a long time already. Let us turn now to what came out of the still, beyond rose water. Rose water first, because it was the most valued and the most used. It went into the infirmary for washing wounds and bathing hot foreheads and for eye troubles. It went into the kitchen, because rose water was a genuine and common flavoring in medieval cookery, and appears in a very large number of surviving recipes. It went to the church. It was given away as a gift to guests of standing, and in some houses it was one of the few things the community produced that had a real value outside its own walls. Then the other waters: elderflower water, lavender water, water of bitterny, of fennel, take of sage, of borage, of chamomile, of violets. The medieval and early modern books are full of lists of distilled waters with a use assigned to each, and the honest modern assessment of most of them is that they were mild, pleasant, and largely gentle in effect, which for a great many complaints was exactly right, and did no harm at all. Then the syrups and the honeys, which are not distilled but were usually made in the same room by the same hands. A syrup is a strong infusion or decoction of a plant, strained and then cooked down with sugar or honey until it will keep. An oxymel is the same idea with vinegar and honey. An electuary is a powdered material worked into honey to a thick paste, made to be taken off the end of a spoon or a knife. And then the oils, not distilled essential oils, which belong to a later and more technical stage of the craft, but infused oils, which are far simpler and were made everywhere. Flowers or leaves packed into a jar, covered with oil, stood in the sun for weeks strained, and the process sometimes repeated with fresh material to strengthen it. Oil of roses, oil of chamomile, oil of St. John's wort, which turns a deep and unmistakable red as it stands, and which was used on wounds and burns and aching joints for many centuries before anybody could say why. We turn now to the vessels themselves, and to how easily all of this could go wrong. Glass in this period was expensive, uneven, full of small bubbles, and fragile in the face of heat. A glass receiver could crack on a cold morning if the liquid coming into it was too warm and the room too cold. A luting of paste or clay sealing the joint between the body and the head could dry out and let the steam escape, and steam escaping is product lost. A tube could block. A fire could be left to a novice for a quarter of an hour and be found roaring. Every still room in every century has had a shelf of broken things at the back, and the medieval one was no different. And so a day of distilling was, for our gardener, a day spent almost entirely sitting still, indoors in a hot damp room, doing very little except watching a fire and a drip, in the middle of the busiest month of his year. It is one of the few days he does not sweep the paths. Let us turn now to what he does with the finished water, because the storing of it mattered nearly as much as the making. It goes into bottles or jars of glass or glazed earthenware, stoppered with a cork or a plug of wax cloth, and it goes into the coolest and darkest place available, which in most houses meant a cellar or a north-facing store. Rose water keeps for months, but it does not keep forever, and it will spoil if it is left warm and in the light. A well-run house labeled and dated what it made, in whatever way it could, and the year's rose water was expected to see the infirmary through, until the roses came again. He carries the first full bottle up the path himself, in both hands, and hands it in at the infirmary door, and comes back down for the next basket of petals. We turn now to midsummer and to the shortest night of the year. The summer solstice falls on the longest day, and the church fixed the feast of the Nativity of John the Baptist on the 24th of June, so that the eve of that feast, the 23rd, sits almost exactly on the turn of the year's light. Across an enormous area of Europe, that eve was one of the great nights of the folk calendar. Fires were lit on high ground and at crossroads and in village greens. People stayed up. Wheels were rolled, in some places downhill and burning, and herbs were gathered. The belief that herbs cut on St. John's Eve were at their strongest is one of the most widespread in the whole of European plant lore. It attaches to a great many plants, and it attaches above all to one, which carries the association in its own name to this day. St. John's wort, that low bushy plant with the 5-petaled yellow flowers, which comes into flower almost exactly at the solstice, as though it had been told to. Hold a leaf of it up against the light, and it is covered in tiny translucent dots that look like pinpricks, and the old explanation for those dots is one of the most memorable stories in European herb lore, tying them to the saint's own death. The red oil that the flowers give when they are crushed or steeped was explained in the same way. It is, in the plainest terms, a plant with a story attached to every visible feature it has, and that is a large part of why it stayed in use for so long. Let us turn now to what our gardener actually does on that night, which is probably less dramatic than the bonfires outside. A monastery is not a village green. The night office still happens. The community still rises for matins in the small hours, and there is no dispensation for a fire festival. But the gathering of St. John's wort at midsummer is recorded so widely across religious and lay practice alike that we can be confident the herbs were cut in the right week, and the plant was hung over doorways in a great many houses, monastic and otherwise, for the protection it was believed to give. So he goes out in the long light after Vespers, on the eve or on the day itself, with a basket and a knife, and cuts the St. John's wort at the top of its flowering, taking the flowering tops, and not the woody base, and carries it in. Some of it goes straight into a jar of oil to stand in the sun. Some goes up to the loft to dry, and a bundle of it, in most houses, goes above a door, outside the wall, on the hill. Somebody else's fire is burning, and he can see the light of it on the underside of the smoke, and he goes in. We turn now to the drying loft, which from this week onward is the true center of the whole operation. It is the space above the workshop, reached by a ladder, directly under the roof. It is dark, because light bleaches the color and the virtue out of a drying herb. It is airy, because a herb that dries slowly in still air goes moldy from the inside and is worthless. And it is warm, because it is under a roof that has had sun on it all day. Those three conditions, dark, airy and warm, are the whole science of drying herbs, and they were understood perfectly well long before anybody could explain them. Let us turn now to how the herbs are actually hung. They come up the ladder in armfuls, and they are tied into bundles, and the bundles are small. This is the single most common mistake a beginner makes, and the medieval gardener does not make it. A fat bundle dries on the outside and stays damp in the middle, and the middle spoils, and the whole bundle is lost. So he ties them thin, a dozen stems to a bunch. with a loop of twine that can be tightened as the stems shrink, because stems do shrink, and a bundle tied hard in July is a loose bundle on the floor by August. They hang head down from the beams and from lines of cord strung across the loft, and they hang clear of one another and clear of the wall. Some things are not hung at all. Flowers, petals and small leaves are laid out flat on trays, or on cloths, or on frames of stretched sacking, in a single thin layer, and turned by hand every day, so that nothing sits damp against the surface. Roots do not come up here at all in July. Roots are an autumn matter, and they need different handling, and we will come to them in October. We turn now to the enemies of the loft. Damp first. A wet week in July with the air heavy, and the roof not warming is genuinely dangerous, and a loft that is filling up with fresh green material in that weather can lose a great deal very quickly. The answer is air, so shutters and vents are opened wide, and in the worst weather a small fire below helps. My second. A loft of dried seed heads and flowers is a paradise, and every store in every century has had this fight. The countermeasures are a cat, and a great deal of vigilance, and hanging things clear of the walls so that nothing can be reached from a beam. Moth and beetle third, which get into the stored material rather than the drying material, and which are one of the reasons wormwood and southernwood and lavender were tucked in among stored goods. And light fourth, which does not spoil a herb in any obvious way, but takes the color out of it, and, along with the color, a good deal of what it was gathered for. A green herb that has dried to a pale straw color has lost more than its appearance, and every experienced hand knew that the best dried herb still looked, faintly and dustily, like itself. Let us turn now to how he knows when a thing is dry, which sounds trivial, and is not. A herb that is taken down too soon carries enough moisture inside the stem to spoil a whole sealed pot from within. And a herb left hanging too long past its readiness goes brittle to the point of dust, and sheds most of its leaf on the floor when it is handled. The window between the two is a matter of days. The test is entirely by hand, and it has not changed. A leaf is ready when it crumbles cleanly between finger and thumb rather than folding. A stem is ready when it snaps rather than bends. If the leaf is right and the stem still bends, it goes back up for another day, because the stem is where the last of the water hides. And then it comes down, and it is stripped, and here there is a small distinction that mattered. Some material is stripped from the stem immediately and stored as loose leaf, which takes less room and is ready to use. Some is deliberately left on the stem because a whole leaf on a stem keeps its scent longer than a stripped and crumbled one, and is broken up only when it is needed. The gardener makes that decision plant by plant, and the general rule is that the more aromatic the herb, the later it should be broken. The stripped material goes into stoppered pots, into glazed jars, into linen bags, into wooden boxes with close lids, and every one of them goes into the dark. And on the outside of each, in whatever system the house uses, goes a mark, a word where the gardener writes, a scratched symbol where he does not, a colored thread, a knot, a shape cut into the wooden lid. We turn now to the smell of that loft in the middle of July, because it is the one thing about this entire year that no description quite reaches. Everything is up there at once: mint and sage and rosemary and thyme, lavender in long grey-blue ropes, chamomile on trays, sweet and apple sharp, rose petals darkening from red to something deeper, wormwood, bitter even to the nose, fennel and dill, aniseed and green, St. John's wort, hyssop, marjoram, yarrow with its odd sharp scent that is not quite pleasant on its own and is unmistakable once you know it. None of it separate. All of it at once, in warm, still air under a roof, in a room where a man has to duck his head. The gardener climbs the ladder in the late afternoon with another armful and stands there for a moment in the middle of it before he starts tying, and the whole year so far is in that one breath. We turn now to August, which is the month in which there is more to do than there are hours to do it in. Everything in the garden is ready at once, or nearly so, and everything that is ready has a window, and the windows overlap. The lavender wants cutting. The wormwood wants cutting. The chamomile has to be picked over again. The marigold has to be picked over again. The hyssop and the marjoram and the savory are at their peak. The poppy heads are ripening and will shed if they are left. The mint is at its fullest and will begin to flower and coarsen if it is not taken. And every one of those jobs is best done on a dry day, and dry days in a northern August are not guaranteed. This is the month that separates a well-run Physic garden from a badly run one, and the difference is almost entirely a matter of sequence. A gardener who does the jobs in the wrong order loses 2 of them. Let us turn now to Lammas, which opens the month and which is not really about the garden at all. The 1st of August was the feast that marked the beginning of the grain harvest, and its Old English name means loaf mass, because a loaf baked from the first of the new corn was brought to the church and blessed. It is one of the most purely agricultural moments in the whole church year, and it did not survive as a major feast into modern practice, but in a medieval community it mattered enormously, because from Lammas onwards the entire question of whether there would be enough food for the coming year began to be answered. And here is the thing that a modern reader can easily miss about our gardener's August. He is not in the garden for a great deal of it. When the grain harvest came in, a medieval monastery put nearly everybody into the fields. The rule that governed most houses expected the brothers to work with their hands and made specific allowance for the harvest, acknowledging plainly that at that season the community would be occupied with reaping, and that this was proper work for monks. In many houses the harvest was brought in by hired labor and tenants, with the brothers overseeing, and in others the community itself went out with sickles. Either way, the herb garden was not the priority in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of August, and the man who tends it went where he was sent. So he works his own beds early and late, in the hour after prime, and the hours after the field work is done. And he does the jobs that cannot wait and lets the others slide. We turn now to the lavender, which is the job he will not let slide. Lavender is cut when the flowers on each spike are mostly open, but the topmost ones have not yet begun to brown, and that is a narrow window of perhaps 10 days. Cut too early and the scent has not developed. Cut too late and the flowers shatter off the stem in the loft and are lost on the floor. He cuts with a small sickle or a knife, gathering a handful of stems in his left hand and drawing the blade through them just above the woody base, and every handful is laid the same way round in the basket so that the bundles can be tied without sorting. The bundles go up to the loft, hung in the airiest part, and lavender is one of the plants that keeps best of all and holds its scent for a year or more. And its uses ran right through the household, rather than being confined to the infirmary. Lavender went into the linen. It went into the wash water. It was strewn on floors. It went into sweet bags and into the small stuffed cushions that were laid in a sick person's bed. And an infusion of it was given for headache and for restlessness, which is a use that never went away and has not gone away yet. Let us turn now to the wormwood and the bitter herbs. Wormwood is cut at flowering, and it is one of the least pleasant jobs of the month, because handling it in quantity leaves the hands smelling bitter for a day, and the smell transfers to anything else touched. Its name in the old northern tongues is the root of the word vermouth, by way of German, and its old and enduring reputation was against worms and against the insects of the household. Most of the wormwood crop did not go to the infirmary at all. It went to the floors, the beds, the linen presses, and the grain store. Medieval households were thoroughly infested by modern standards, with fleas and lice a routine condition of ordinary life, and the aromatic bitter herbs were one of the few weapons anybody had. Wormwood, southernwood, tansy, fleabane, rue and mint were strewn among the rushes on the floor, so that walking on them released the scent, laid in chests among clothes, and pushed into mattresses. Tansy in particular, with its flat gold buttons and its sharp scent, was scattered on floors and around meat safes, and it also had a place in the kitchen at Easter in a form that has now almost entirely disappeared. We turn now to the middle of August, and to a ceremony that put the whole of the gardener's year into the church for one day. On the 15th of August, the Feast of the Assumption, there was a custom across a very wide stretch of Central and Northern Europe of bringing bundles of herbs into the church to be blessed. In the German-speaking lands it has a name that survives to this day, and the bundles have their own name too, and the practice is genuinely old, recorded from the early medieval centuries onward. The bundle was made up of a set number of plants, the number varying by region, and it typically included mugwort, yarrow, tansy, wormwood, valerian, mint, chamomile, and a stem of grain at the center. After the blessing, the bundle was taken home and hung in the house, above the door or under the roof, and pieces of it were used through the year. Some of it went into the fire during a thunderstorm. Some was given to sick animals. Some was laid in the coffin of the dead. For our gardener, whatever the particular custom of his own house and region. This is the one day in the year when the material he grows is carried up the path, through the cloister, and into the church itself, and stands in front of the altar, with everyone looking at it. It is not a large thing, but a man who has spent 5 months on his knees in the dirt is, for one morning, standing in the nave with the results in his hands. Let us turn now to the heat, and to the state of the garden by the end of the month. August in a hot, dry year is hard on a garden with no irrigation beyond a pot. The paths bake. The soil cracks where it is bare. The shallow-rooted things bolt, which is to say they give up on making leaves, and run straight to flower and seed, and once a lettuce or a chervil plant has bolted, it is bitter and finished. Some of this is welcome, because seed is wanted, and we will come to the saving of it in September. Most of it is simply loss. The beds look, by the end of August, distinctly untidy. Half of them have been cut hard back and are stubble. Others have gone over and are yellowing. The paths have weeds in them that have been there for 3 weeks because nobody has had a spare hour, and the loft above the workshop is full, absolutely full, in a way it will not be again until this time next year, with bundles hanging so close that a man has to turn sideways between them, and trays of flowers on every surface, and the smell so thick that it takes a moment to get used to it on the ladder. That fullness is the whole point of everything that has happened since March. Every hour of thinning and weeding and watering and picking exists to fill this one room, once a year, deep enough to last until the roses come again. And there is one more thing about August that is easy to overlook, which is how much of it is spent simply carrying. Nothing in this garden moves itself. Every basket of lavender, every armful of wormwood, every tray of chamomile, every pot of water, goes from where it is to where it needs to be on a man's arms, up a ladder, along a path, through a door. The distances are small, and the repetitions are not. A gardener in August walks a great many miles without ever leaving an enclosure the size of a modest field, and he does it in wool, in heat, on ground that is either dust or mud, with something in both hands. That is the plain physical truth underneath every romantic picture of a monastery herb garden ever painted. It was, above all else, carrying. We turn now to the door at the far end of the path, which we have mentioned several times and never gone through. The Physic garden of a monastery was very often laid out beside the infirmary, and the plan of St. Gall shows this arrangement clearly, with the herb beds set beside the physician's house, and the infirmary rather than out with the kitchen garden. The reason is simply distance. A sick man's medicine should not have to be carried across the whole precinct. So there is a door in the wall at the far end, and beyond it a short paved path, and at the end of that path the infirmary itself. Let us turn now to the man who receives what the garden sends. He is the infirmary, and in a house of any size he is a full obedientiary with a charge of his own, listed alongside the cellarer, the sacrist, the almoner, and the guest master. He has an assistant or several. He has a building or a range of buildings, usually including a hall with beds down its sides, a chapel or an altar where the sick could hear Mass without leaving their beds, a kitchen of its own, and a latrine. The infirmary kitchen matters more than it sounds. The ordinary monastic diet was restricted, and in many orders meat was prohibited or heavily limited for the healthy. But the sick were allowed what the healthy were not, including meat, and the infirmary therefore had to cook separately. A brother who had been ill and was recovering ate better than a brother who had not, and this created, in a great many houses over a great many centuries, exactly the small tension you would expect. We turn now to the rule and to a single sentence that shaped all of this, the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and the foundation of most Western monastic life for the next 1,000 years, devotes a short chapter to the care of the sick, and it opens with a statement of remarkable directness. The care of the sick is to be placed above and before every other duty. They are to be served as though they were Christ himself. That sentence is the reason there is an infirmary at all, and it is the reason there is a Physic garden beside it, and it is not too much to say that it is the reason a great deal of practical medical knowledge survived in Western Europe through some very unpromising centuries. A community formerly obliged to look after its sick will, over time, accumulate people who are good at it, buildings suited to it, books about it, and gardens for it. The same chapter also contains a quieter and more human line, warning that the sick must not distress their servers by unreasonable demands. Whoever wrote that had clearly nursed somebody. Let us turn now to the cupboard, which is where the gardener's year physically ends up. The infirmary keeps a store, and in the better documented houses we have a fair idea of what was in it. Dried herbs from the garden, in bags and boxes, waters from the still, syrups and conserves in pots, honey, vinegar, oils both plain and infused, wax and tallow and resin for salves, linen for bandaging torn and rolled, and in a house with money, a small number of bought ingredients from a distance that no garden in the north could ever produce: pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, frankincense, sugar, which in this period was a medicine before it was a food and was kept with the medicines. Theriac, that famous and enormously complicated compound preparation, bought in from Venice or Genoa at real expense by houses that could afford it. The great majority of what is in that cupboard, though, came from 100 yards away through a door in a wall. We turn now to the bleeding house, which is the other reason the infirmary was busy. Regular bloodletting was a standard part of the monastic health regime, not a treatment for illness, but a routine maintenance of the body carried out 3, 4 or 5 times a year on a fixed schedule. The practice had its own vocabulary, and in English houses the period of rest afterwards was called the sani. A brother who had been bled was excused from some of the offices, allowed extra sleep, given a better diet including meat in some houses, and permitted to talk more freely for a few days. The effect of this was that the infirmary was not only a place for the sick, it had a steady rotating population of entirely healthy men in a state of sanctioned rest, eating well and recovering from a procedure that had probably done them no good whatever. And it created its own demand on the garden, because the aftercare of bleeding involved warm broths, restorative drinks, gentle syrups, and the herbs that were held to make good blood. We turn now to what was actually made at the bedside, because most of it was simpler than the word medicine suggests. The commonest preparation of all was an infusion, which is to say leaves or flowers steeped in water that has been boiled and taken off the heat, covered, and left to stand for a while before straining. Anything soft and aromatic was treated this way, because hard boiling drives the scent out of the pot and into the room. Next commonest was a decoction, which is the harder version, used for roots, barks and seeds, where the material is simmered in water for a considerable time to draw out what will not come out by steeping alone. A decoction of elecampane root for a chest, of comfrey root for a bruise, of barley for a fever, of licorice where it could be had. Then the poultice, which is material bruised or boiled soft, wrapped in a cloth and laid warm on the body, and the fomentation, which is a cloth wrung out of a hot infusion and applied and renewed as it cools. Both of these were used constantly, and both of them are, in honest modern terms, largely warmth applied to a sore place by somebody paying attention, which is a genuinely useful thing whatever is in the cloth. Then the salve, made by warming an infused oil with beeswax until the two combine, and testing the set by dropping a little onto a cold surface and pressing it with a finger. Then the plain foods that counted as medicine: barley water, almond milk, which appears constantly in medieval sickroom writing, and was used where dairy was not permitted or not tolerated. Broths and gruels. A caudle, which is a warm, spiced, thickened drink of ale or wine, given to the weak and to women after childbirth in the world outside the walls. And running through all of it, honey, which sweetened what was bitter, preserved what would otherwise spoil, and was laid directly on wounds in a practice that ran from the ancient world through the whole medieval period, and has in our own time been looked at again with some interest. Let us turn now to the last door, which is the one that opens outward. Beyond the infirmary, at the edge of the precinct, is the almoner's gate, and outside it stand the poor of the district. A monastery was expected to give, and it gave food, and it also gave, in a great many places, and to a degree that varied enormously from house to house, medical help. This is where a physic garden reached furthest. The village had no physician. The nearest trained man might be a day's ride away, and would want silver. The abbey had a garden, a store, a book or two, and a man who knew what was in them. And for a great many ordinary people across a great many centuries, that was the only medical resource within reach. The gardener would rarely have seen this end of it himself. He grew the plants, and he handed them in at the door and went back to his beds. But the line runs all the way from a seed pressed into soil with a wooden debbar in March, through the loft and the still and the cupboard, to a woman at a gate in November with a sick child and nothing to pay with, and it is worth following once before we go back into the garden. Let us turn now, before we go back out, to the gate at the far edge of the precinct, and to the season in which it matters most. The poor came to a monastery all year, and they came hardest in the winter. December, January and February were the months of genuine want, when a household's stores were being eaten down, and there was no possibility of growing anything, and the almoner's dole of bread and broth was the difference between hunger and something worse for a certain number of people in every district. And with the hunger came illness, and with the illness came requests, and a house with a full loft was in a position to give something beyond food. None of this was systematic, and the quality of it varied enormously from house to house and from decade to decade. Some monasteries were generous, and some were not, and the historical record contains both the praise and the complaints. But the physical fact of a store of dried herbs standing 100 yards from a gate at which poor people were queuing in December is one worth holding in mind, because it is the point at which a walled garden with a locked door touched the lives of people who would never see the inside of it. Let us turn now to September, and to the quietest and most important job of the entire year. Everything we have described so far, all the sowing and thinning and watering and cutting and drying, depends on one thing that we have so far taken entirely for granted. There has to be seed. And in a medieval garden there was no shop to buy it from, no packet, no supplier, no catalogue. Seed came from 3 places only. It was saved from your own plants, or it was given to you by somebody else who had saved it from theirs, or in rare and expensive cases it came from a distance as a gift, or a purchase for something that would not otherwise grow in your country at all. Which means that the whole existence of the garden next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, rests on a few hours of careful work in September and on a wooden box in the workshop. We turn now to the difficulty of it, which is greater than it first appears. To save seed from a plant, you have to not harvest that plant. You have to let it do the thing you have spent all summer preventing it from doing, which is to stop making leaves and run up to flower and set seed and go over entirely. A lettuce saved for seed is a bitter useless thing 4 feet tall with a bare stem. A row of parsley saved for seed gives you no parsley worth eating. A leek saved for seed spends a second whole year in the ground, occupying space and giving nothing back until it finally throws its great round head of flower. So a proportion of the garden, every year, is deliberately given over to plants that will never be used, and the gardener has to decide in June which ones, and mark them, and then defend them from his own kitchen for 3 months. And he does not simply leave whatever happens to be left over. He chooses. He marks the best plants he has, the ones that stood longest before bolting, the ones that came through the cold, the ones that grew biggest or straightest or most true to the sort he wants. And he says from those and not from the runts. This is selection, plainly and simply, carried out by hand and by eye, and it was going on in every garden in Europe every year for a very long time, before anybody wrote a word of theory about it. The plants in a medieval Physic garden were not wild plants. They were the descendants of several hundred generations of somebody's judgment about which head to leave standing. Let us turn now to the actual gathering, which is done on a dry day, and only on a dry day. He goes out with a shallow basket and a cloth and a knife. In the middle of the day, when whatever dew there was has long gone, and he works along the marked plants, for anything that holds its seed in a head or an umbel, which covers a great many of the plants in this garden. The method is to cut the whole head off into the basket, or to bend the head over into the mouth of the basket and cut it there so that nothing shakes loose on the way. Dill, fennel, coriander, caraway, angelica, lovage, parsley, carrot, and the rest all come in this way. For anything that holds seed in a pod, the pods are picked when they have gone brown and papery, but before they have split, which is a matter of days, and sometimes of hours in hot weather. For poppies, the whole head is cut with a length of stalk, and a poppy head is a beautiful piece of engineering with a ring of little windows under the cap that open when the seed is ready, so that a ripe head shaken over the hand rattles and pours. For anything that scatters instantly and cannot be caught, the trick recorded in old practice is to tie a cloth or a paper bag over the head while it is still on the plant and let it ripen inside that. We turn now to the drying and cleaning, which happens in the workshop. The cut heads are spread on cloths or in shallow trays and left in the warm, dry air. Not in the loft where the herbs are hanging, but somewhere with more light and less crowding, and turned every day for a week or 2, until the whole is thoroughly dry and rustling. Then comes the threshing, and it is done exactly as grain is threshed, only smaller. The dried heads are rubbed between the hands, or beaten gently in a cloth, or trodden in a sack, until the seed comes free of the husks and stalks. And then the winnowing, which is the part that has to be done on the right kind of day. The mixture of seed and chaff is poured slowly from one bowl into another, from a height, in a light, steady breeze, and the breeze takes the chaff away sideways, while the seed, being heavier, falls more or less straight. It takes several pourings, and it takes patience, and it does not work at all on a still day or a gusty one. Or it is done through a sieve, and the workshop has several, with different weaves, so that a fine seed can be shaken through a mesh that holds the rubbish back, or a coarse seed held in a mesh that lets the rubbish through. Let us turn now to the chest itself. It is a wooden box with a close lid, kept in the driest corner of the workshop, up off the floor and away from the outside wall. Inside it are small linen bags and stoppered pots of glazed earthenware and folded packets, and each of them holds one kind of seed. Damp is the enemy. Seed that goes into store carrying moisture will heat and go moldy and be dead by February. Mice are the other enemy, and a seed chest is exactly what a mouse would design if a mouse could design a building. So the box is close-fitted and heavy-lidded, and it is checked, as we saw all the way back in January, in the dead of winter, when the gardener has time. We turn now to the labeling, which was a real problem and was solved in some quietly clever ways. A monastery gardener could very often read and write, which puts him ahead of nearly every other gardener in Europe at this date. And where he could, he wrote a word in ink on a scrap of parchment tucked into the bag, or a name cut into the wooden lid of a pot. But even a literate man will not write a label in a dark workshop with cold hands, and the systems that actually get used are the ones that work by touch and by glance, are not tied in the neck cord of a bag, one knot for one thing and two for another. A coloured thread, a notch cut in the rim, a pot of a particular shape, kept always for one seed. And behind all of those, the simple ordering of the chest itself, so that the third pot from the left in the second row is what it has been for 11 years. Let us turn now to the seeds that will not keep, because they are the reason a gardener has to think a year ahead. Not all seed lasts. Some is good for 5 or 6 years and loses very little. Cabbage and its relations and most of the mustards keep well. Some is good for 2 or 3, and some is genuinely poor after a single winter. And the umbellifers, which is to say a great many of the most important plants in this garden, are the worst offenders. Parsnip in particular is notorious, and parsley, angelica, chervil and lovage all fall away fast, which means that some seeds must be saved every single year without fail, while others can be skipped when the season is against you. And the gardener who does not know which is which will discover the difference in a bare bed in May, when it is far too late to do anything about it. We turn now to the orchard, because September belongs to it as much as to the seed. The trees stand among the graves. In the arrangement the old plan drew, and they have been quietly getting on with their year while we were busy elsewhere. Apples, pears, plums, quinces, medlars, cherries, and in the warmer regions figs and peaches and the vine. The fruit is picked by hand and by ladder, and it is picked with a care that surprises people who have not stored fruit, because a bruised apple rots, and a rotting apple in a store takes its neighbours with it. So each one is lifted with the palm, rather than pulled, and laid rather than dropped into the basket. Then it is sorted ruthlessly. The perfect fruit goes to store, laid out on slatted shelves in a cool dark room not touching, and looked over every few weeks so that anything going soft can be taken out before it spreads. The marked and bruised fruit is used at once or made into something. The juice from the sour crab apples, which was the sharp cooking liquid of the medieval kitchen, where a modern one would reach for lemon or vinegar. Cider where cider was made. Perry from pears, dried rings of apple threaded on strings and hung. And the quince and the medlar have their own peculiarities. Quince is hard and astringent and inedible raw, and is cooked long and slowly with honey into a thick fragrant paste that keeps for a very long time. The medlar has to be left until it is half rotten before it can be eaten at all, a process with a blunt Old English name, and it was laid out on straw to reach that state, and then eaten in the depth of winter, when almost nothing else fresh existed. All of this was medicine as well as food, in the reckoning of the time. Fruit was thought to be difficult and cooling, and was assigned careful places in the diet, and the cooked and honeyed forms were considered far safer than the raw, which is one of the more sensible pieces of medieval dietary advice in a world with no refrigeration. We turn now to the exchange, which is the pleasant part of September. Seed was given. A house with a good stock of something sent a packet to another house that had lost theirs, and travellers carried small parcels of seed a long way. And a brother moving from one monastery to another very often went with a few bags in his baggage. This is one of the main ways that plants spread across medieval Europe, quietly, in ones and twos, between institutions that wrote to one another anyway. And so a bed of some particular herb in our garden may exist because a man arrived on a wet afternoon 15 years ago from a house 200 miles away with a linen bag in his sleeve. And that story, in one form or another, sits behind a surprising number of the plants standing in the beds around us tonight. Let us turn now to October and to the work that goes downward. The green part of the year is over. The leaves are yellowing and falling. The frosts have begun in the low corner by the wall, and the beds have that particular late look about them, still full but plainly finished. And now the gardener does the thing he has not done since February. He digs. We turn now to why roots are lifted at this time and not another. The reasoning of the old herbals, repeated across centuries and in many languages, is that the strength of the plant withdraws downward as the season ends. The top dies back, and what the plant has made over the summer is drawn into the root, and the root sits through winter as a store waiting for spring. This is, as it happens, broadly correct, and modern analysis of the substances in medicinal roots does generally find them at their highest after the top has died down and before growth begins again. The medieval gardener had arrived at the right answer from an entirely different direction by watching plants for a great many years and noticing that autumn roots worked better than spring ones. So the rule is simple. Roots are lifted after the tops have gone over and before the ground freezes hard, which in most of northern Europe means October and into November. Let us turn now to the roots themselves, bed by bed. Elecampane first, because it is the largest. A great coarse plant with leaves like a giant's plantain and a tall yellow flower, and beneath it a thick fleshy root that has to be got out with a fork and a good deal of leverage. It was one of the great chest remedies of the medieval pharmacy, given for coughs, and for troubled breathing in every form, usually as a decoction or candied in honey. And it appears in the old lists so consistently that a garden without it would be an odd garden. Comfrey next, with its black outside and white slippery inside, dug for poultices and for the old reputation that sits inside its country name of knitbone. Comfrey root grated into a paste with water sets firm as it dries and holds a limb steady, which is a genuinely ingenious use of a plant. Angelica, tall and hollow-stemmed and sweetly aromatic in every part, dug for a root that was regarded as warming and strengthening and was later candied as a sweetmeat. Iris, and specifically the pale flag iris, that the St. Gall plan gives a bed of its own, dug for the rhizome, which when it is dried and kept for a year or two develops a scent of violets. That scent made it valuable well beyond medicine, in powders and perfumes, and in the linen press, and it is one of the few things in this garden that improves with storing. Marshmallow, dug for a root full of a soothing slipperiness that made it one of the standard remedies for a sore throat, a cough, or an irritated gut. Licorice, in the houses far enough south, or sheltered enough to grow it, dug with some difficulty because the root runs deep. Burdock, dug from the waste ground rather than a bed because burdock plants itself. Yellow dock, the same. Dandelion, the same again, and the gardener who has spent the whole summer pulling dandelions out of his paths now goes looking for the biggest ones deliberately. Let us turn now to the processing, which has to happen fast. A lifted root is a wet object, and it will rot if it is simply put in a corner. So it is washed at once, in a trough or under the spout, and scrubbed with a brush or a handful of straw until the soil is off it. Then it is cut. Thick roots are split lengthwise or sliced across into rounds, because a whole thick root will never dry through, and one that appears dry on the outside and is damp at the core will spoil the pot it is stored in. Then it is dried, and roots need more heat than leaves. They go near the fire, or on a rack above the kitchen hearth, or in the warm part of the loft directly under the roof slates, and they take days rather than hours, and they are turned. And a dried root is genuinely hard. It goes into store as a wooden thing that has to be broken or grated or pounded in the mortar before it can be used, which is why the infirmary mortar is a heavy one. We turn now to the roots that are not dried at all, but kept alive. Some things were wanted fresh through the winter, and the way to keep them was to keep them dormant rather than dead. Roots were laid in a box or a pit in layers of dry sand, or in a clamp, which is a heap on the ground covered with straw and then with earth, closed against frost with a small vent of straw at the top so that it does not sweat and rot. This is the same technique used for the year's carrots and turnips and beet in the kitchen garden, and it works because a root in cool, damp sand in the dark simply goes on being a root, believing it is still underground, until it is dug out in January. And there is one more thing to say about roots, which is that they are the part of the garden a gardener can most easily get wrong beyond repair. A leaf taken from a plant is replaced. A flower picked is replaced. A root dug out is the plant. So the digging of roots is done with an eye on the following year in a way that nothing else in the calendar is, and the rule that a careful gardener follows is to take part and leave part. He lifts the clump, cuts away what he wants, and puts the remainder back in the ground with fresh soil around it, and in 3 years it is a full clump again. The alternative, lifting the whole of everything, gives him a very good winter and an empty bed for a decade. Let us turn now to the dividing, which is the other half of October and the reason a Physic garden renews itself. Many of the plants here are not raised from seed at all. They are increased by division, which means digging up an established clump, breaking it apart, and replanting the pieces, and autumn is the time for it. The mint is lifted and torn into handfuls of rooted runner and replanted in fresh soil, because a mint bed exhausts itself and its own ground within a few years and goes thin and small in the middle. The comfrey is divided, and comfrey is enthusiastic about this to the point of nuisance, since any fragment of root left in the soil becomes another plant. The chives, the sorrel, the lovage crowns, the tansy, the costmary, and the bergamot of later gardens all come apart the same way. And the pieces that are surplus do not go on the heap. They go into a basket, and they go to whoever housed for them, another house, a neighboring manor, the village, and they are the same quiet traffic in plants that we saw with the seed. Let us turn now to the leaves, which fall on everything in October, and which a good gardener does not resent. The trees in the orchard and along the boundary shed, and the wind carries a good deal of it into the garden, where it lodges against the wattle edges and fills the corners and lies in drifts along the north wall. He sweeps it up, and he does not burn it. It goes into a corner behind the shed, heaped and trodden and left, and in 2 years it will have become the dark, crumbling leaf mould that is the best thing that can be put on a seedbed. This is one of the oldest and least glamorous forms of patience in gardening. A heap of leaves swept up this October will not be used until the October after next, which means the man sweeping is doing a favor to himself 2 years older, or possibly to whoever comes after him. And the last mowing of the mead is done, or rather the last scything. Cut low and the hay of it carried off, because a rough sward left long and wet through winter goes to coarse grass, and the small flowers of it are smothered by spring. We turn now to the state of the garden at the end of October. The beds are dark and open. The tall things have been cut down, and the cuttings carted away. Half the ground has been dug over and left rough for the frost, which is exactly where we came in 9 months ago, except that this time we have watched every stage of it happen. The loft is full and going quiet as the hanging bundles finish drying. The store is at its deepest of the whole year. The seed chest is closed and full and heavy. And the gardener, walking back down the path in the early dark with mud to the knee and a fork over his shoulder, has for the first time since March very little he urgently has to do tomorrow. Let us turn now to the shelf, because in the dark evenings that follow the root harvest there is time to read, and because our gardener is one of the very few gardeners in Europe who can. This is worth saying plainly. Across the whole of medieval Europe, the overwhelming majority of the people who grew plants could not read a word about them. Everything they knew came from being shown. The monastery is the exception. A brother in a house of any size had access to a library, and if he was the man in charge of the herbs, some of the books in that library were about herbs, and he could go and get them. That single fact is the difference between a Physic garden and a very good peasant garden. Not the plants, which were often the same. The books. We turn now to what was actually on that shelf. At the foundation of everything sits a Greek work of the 1st century, written by a man named Dioscorides, who had served with the Roman armies and had used his travels to look at plants. He called it On Medical Material, and in its Latin form as De Materia Medica, it described several hundred plants, animals and minerals, what each looked like, where it grew, and what it was used for. It is not too much to say that this one book was the backbone of European pharmacy for something like a millennium and a half. Copied, translated, abridged, illustrated, argued over and copied again. It passed from Greek into Latin, into Arabic, into a great many vernaculars, and it was still being consulted seriously as a working text in the 16th century. If a plant is in a medieval physic garden, there is a very good chance that the reason it is there can be traced back through a chain of copies to a line in Dioscorides. Beside it, in most substantial libraries, sits Pliny, whose enormous natural history gathered up an extraordinary quantity of information about the world, including a great deal about plants and their uses. Pliny is less careful than Dioscorides and considerably more entertaining, and he preserved a large amount of Roman practice that would otherwise be entirely lost. Then the Encyclopedia of Isidore, the 7th century Bishop of Seville, whose etymologies attempted to explain the whole of knowledge by way of the origins of words, and which was in almost every monastic library in Europe. Let us turn now to the smaller and more practical books, which are the ones a gardener would actually take down. There is a herbal that circulated under the name of a Puleus, usually called the Herbarium, which is a short and manageable book arranged plant by plant, each with a picture and a list of complaints it answers. It was hugely popular precisely because it was short. A working infirmary does not want 1,000 pages. He wants a plant, a picture and an instruction, and this book gives him that. It was translated into Old English before the Norman Conquest, which tells you how deep into ordinary practice it had gone. There is a verse herbal of the 11th century, usually known by the name Mesa, which sets out the virtues of a set of plants in Latin hexameters. Verse sounds like an odd choice for a reference book, until you remember that a text in meter can be memorized. And a memorized text is available in a dark infirmary at 3 in the morning when the book is elsewhere. A great deal of medieval technical knowledge was put into verse for exactly this reason. There are the medical texts that came north from Salerno, where a genuine school of medicine had grown up in southern Italy, and where in the 11th century a man remembered as Constantine the African translated a body of Arabic medical writing into Latin. Out of that world comes the famous Salernitan verse regimen of health, a long poem of practical advice about diet, sleep, exercise and the seasons that was copied and expanded and translated for centuries. And there are the local books, the ones made in the house itself or in a neighboring one, which are usually the messiest and the most useful. Collections of remedies gathered by somebody who was actually treating people, written in whatever order they occurred to him, with things crossed out and added in the margin. We turn now to 2 books that belong particularly to our garden. The first is not a herbal at all. It is a poem written in the 9th century by Walafrid Strabo, a monk and later abbot of the island monastery of Reichenau in Lake Constance, and it is about his own small garden. It runs to a few hundred lines. He describes the state of the plot when he took it on, ruined and nettle-grown. He describes raised beds boarded up with planks. He describes watering by hand and taking care not to batter the seedlings with too rough a paw. And then he goes through the plants he grows, a couple of dozen of them, with their appearance and their uses, and now and then what he personally thinks of them. What makes it precious is that it is not a copy of anything. It is a man writing about the actual ground under his actual feet, and the small human details in it, the complaining about weeds, the pleasure in a good bed of sage, are the closest we come to hearing a medieval gardener talk about his own work in his own voice. The second is a document of administration rather than of medicine. Towards the end of the 8th century, an ordinance was issued for the management of the royal estates of the Frankish Empire, and near the end of it there is a list of the plants that were to be grown on those estates. It runs to something like 70 plants and a good many fruit trees, and it names, in order, a great many of the things standing in the beds around us tonight: lily and roses, fenugreek, sage and rue, cumin and rosemary, mint and parsley, celery and lovage, savory and radish, and on and on. It is an administrative list, dryly practical, with no medicine in it at all. And it is one of the single most useful pieces of evidence we possess about what was actually growing in northern European gardens at the beginning of the medieval period, because it is not describing an ideal, it is telling somebody what to plant. Let us turn now to Hildegard, who belongs to the 12th century and to the Rhineland. Hildegard of Bingen was an abbess, a composer, a visionary and a writer, and among her writings are 2 works on the natural world and on healing. She describes plants, stones, animals and their properties, and she does so in a framework very much her own, organized around ideas of greenness and vitality and the balance of a person. Her herbal writing is not a copy of Dioscorides. A good deal of it is local, German, and clearly drawn from what people around her actually did with the plants growing around her, which makes it a genuinely different kind of witness. A modern reader has to take it as what it is, a 12th century religious writer's account of medicine, and not as anything else, but as evidence for what was known and used in a Rhineland religious house in her lifetime. It is remarkable, and the fact that it was written by a woman running a community rather than by a physician in a school gives it a texture that very little else from the period has. We turn now to the trouble with all of these books, which our gardener knows better than the men who copied them. The first trouble is the pictures. A herbal is illustrated so that a plant can be identified, and the illustrations in medieval herbals were made by copying the illustrations in an earlier herbal, which had been copied from an earlier one still. Copy a drawing enough times, through the hands of artists who have never seen the plant, and it drifts. Leaves become symmetrical decorations. Roots become faces. A recognizable plant becomes a pattern. There are surviving herbals where the picture is beautiful and entirely useless for identifying anything in a field. And there are others, generally later, where somebody has plainly gone out and drawn from life, and the difference is immediately visible. The second trouble is the names. Dioscorides described the plants of the Eastern Mediterranean. Our garden is somewhere considerably colder and wetter, and a great many of the plants he names Either do not grow here or grow here as a different but related species. So the northern reader does the only thing he can do, which is to attach the old name to the nearest local plant. And the result is a tangle of misapplied names that took centuries to sort out, and in a few cases was never sorted out at all. The third trouble is that a book cannot tell you the thing that matters most, which is what happens in your own soil in your own weather. A text says that a plant likes a dry place. Your garden has one dry place, in the corner by the south wall, and it happens to be the windiest spot you have. No book knows that, so the gardener reads and takes what is useful, and quietly ignores a good deal, and trusts his own beds over the page. And this exact relationship between the written authority and the local hand is one of the most consistent things in the entire history of horticulture. Let us turn now to how a book got onto that shelf in the first place, because it was never a simple matter of wanting one. A manuscript was made by hand, on prepared skin, by a scribe, over weeks or months. It was therefore expensive in a way that is genuinely hard to translate into modern terms. And a house that owned 30 books owned a considerable fortune. Books were listed in inventories alongside plate and vestments. They were left in wills. They were sometimes chained to the desk. So a monastery that wanted a herbal, it did not did one of three things. It bought a copy, rarely. It received one as a gift, which happened more often, since giving a book to a religious house was a recognized act of piety. Or, most commonly, it borrowed one and copied it, sending a brother with the exemplar and getting back, some months later, a new book in the house's own hand. That last practice explains a great deal about how medical knowledge moved. It moved along the lines of friendship and obligation between institutions, one loan at a time. And a text could take a century to travel a few hundred miles, or could arrive in a single season, because two abbots happened to know one another. And when the copy was made, things changed. A scribe skipped a line, a word was misread, a drawing was simplified. Somebody added a remedy that had worked locally in the margin, and the next copyist folded the margin note into the main text, as though it had always been there. By the time a herbal has been copied a dozen times, it is a slightly different book, and comparing surviving copies of the same work is one of the ways scholars now trace where it traveled. Our gardener does not think about any of this. He takes the book down, finds the plant, and goes back out to the bed to look at the real thing. Let us turn now to November and to the month in which the garden is fed. The harvest is in, the roots are lifted, the seed is saved, and the ground is empty. And empty ground that has grown crops all summer is ground that has had a great deal taken out of it and nothing put back. So November is the month of muck. We turn now to where it came from, because a monastery produced a great deal of it. There were stables and there were buyers. There were pigs. There were poultry. There was the yard where the carts stood and the animals waited. And there was the midden, the heap where the waste of all of it went, along with the sweepings of the floors, the ash from the hearths, the spent rushes, the scraps from the kitchen, and a good deal else. The heap rotted. It rotted for a year or two, and it was turned once or twice, and what came out of the bottom of it was a dark, crumbly substance that was worth more to a garden than anything money could buy. And so, on a cold morning in November, a cart comes to the garden gate and stops, and the rest of the day is spent moving its contents by fork and barrow to the beds. Let us turn now to how it was actually used, because there is more judgment in this than there appears. Well, rotted muck goes onto the beds that will grow the hungry things, the leafy pot herbs, the onions and the leeks, the plants that want richness. It is spread thick and either dug in or, in some practice, simply left on the surface for the winter to wash it down and the worms to take it in. Fresh muck goes nowhere near a bed that will be sown in spring, because fresh manure burns young roots and brings a crop of weed seed with it. It goes back on the heap, and some beds get nothing at all on purpose. The woody aromatic herbs, sage and thyme and lavender and rosemary and savory, are all plants of poor, dry, stony ground, and rich soil makes them soft and floppy and weakly scented. A gardener who feeds his thyme is a gardener who will have poor thyme. This distinction between the beds that are fed and the beds that are deliberately starved is one of the clearest signs of a Physic garden that knows what it is doing. Along with the muck goes ash from the hearths, spread thin, and in some regions lime, and in coastal places sand and seaweed, and near a fishing river the waste of fish, and in a town the sweepings of the streets. Everything organic that a community produced went, eventually, back onto ground. We turn now to the digging. The empty beds are dug over and left rough, exactly as we found them in January, the spade turning each cut of soil over onto its back, so that the weeds on top are buried and the clods stand up to catch the frost. It is the heaviest work of the entire year, and it is done in the coldest weather in which it can be done at all, because the alternative is to do it in spring when there is no time. A man digging in November in wool, on wet heavy ground, with a wooden spade shod with iron, and a short shaft that makes him stoop, is doing something that no modern gardener would recognize as the same activity. He digs for an hour and rests, and digs again. The whole garden takes weeks, and he does not dig everything. The beds with standing plants in them are left. The beds that will be sown very early are dug first, and any ground that is truly wet is left alone entirely, because digging a waterlogged bed destroys its structure, and it will be worse next year for the trouble taken. Let us turn now to the mending, which fills the days when the ground is too wet or too frozen to work. The wattle edges have slumped and rotted where they sit in the damp, and new hurdles are woven from the hazel cut in the winter coppice and driven in to replace the worst. The boarded beds have lost pegs. The paths have gone soft in places and are given a load of gravel or of ash. The gate has dropped on its hinge and is lifted and shimmed, and the wall is looked at all the way round, and any stone that has come loose in the summer or been pushed out by a root or a frost is put back, because a gap in a wall is an invitation to every animal in the district, and the damage from one night can be considerable. We turn now to the very beginning of the month, and to 2 days that stood over it. The 1st of November is All Saints, and the 2nd is All Souls, and together they gave the opening of the month a particular character that everybody in the community felt. The 2nd of those days was given to the remembrance of the dead, with bells rung and names read and prayers said for everyone the house had buried. And the house had buried them in the orchard, among the apple trees, in the same ground that gave the fruit. So the gardener who tends that orchard, spends the beginning of November working in a burial ground that has just had the whole community standing in it. He raked the leaves off the graves before the day, and he rakes them off again after. The trees he prunes in February stand over men he knew. Nobody in a medieval monastery found this strange or morbid. The arrangement drawn on the plan of St. Gall, with the trees planted among the graves, was entirely deliberate, and was understood as a fitting one, and the ordinary daily proximity of the living and the dead in such a place is one of the genuine differences between that world and ours. We turn now to Martinmas, on the 11th of November, which is the hinge of the whole month. The feast of Saint Martin marked, across an enormous stretch of Europe, the point at which the beasts that could not be kept through the winter were slaughtered, and the meat salted and smoked and put away. It was a feast in both senses, a day in the church calendar, and a genuine glut of fresh meat in a year that had very little. For the garden this means two things. The first is that the salting requires a great deal of what the garden produces, because salted meat without seasoning is a grim prospect and the herb store is raided for it. The second is that the slaughter produces fat, and fat is the base of every salve the infirmary will make all winter, so a good deal of tallow and lard comes into the store in the weeks after Martinmas and is set aside specifically for medicine. And after Martinmas, the light goes very fast. By the end of the month, the working day in the north is short enough that the outdoor jobs have to be chosen carefully in the morning, because there will not be a second chance in the afternoon. Let us turn now to the plants that have to be got through the winter alive, which is a job with no glory in it at all, and which has to be done before the hard frosts arrive. Not everything in the beds is hardy. Some of the plants that a Physic garden wanted were brought north from warmer countries, and merely tolerate a northern winter in a good year, and in a bad year do not. Rosemary is the great example and the great heartbreak. Bay is nearly as bad, and a hard winter can take a bay to the ground, even when the roots survive. The southern aromatics generally, the lavenders and the hyssops and the savories, are far less certain here than the books that recommended them supposed, because those books were written in a climate with dry cold rather than wet cold, and it is the wet that kills, so the gardener protects. Bracken and straw are heaped over the crowns of the borderline plants and held down with pegged hurdles or with stones. The most valuable things get a screen of woven hurdle on the windward side, which does more good than any covering, because wind on a frozen plant dries it out, and it dies of drought in the middle of a wet winter, which is one of the least intuitive facts in the whole of gardening. Anything in a pot goes into the shed or the lee of the wall, and a good deal of it still fails, and he knows it will, and he takes cuttings in the autumn precisely so that when the parent dies there is a young one coming on. Let us turn now to the last planting of the year, which happens now. Garlic goes in. Garlic is one of the few things planted in the autumn rather than the spring, because it wants a period of cold to divide properly, and a clove pushed into the soil in November stands through the whole winter as a thin green blade and makes a proper head the following summer. Bulbs go in, lily above all, which the St. Gall plan gives its own bed at the head of the herb garden, and which was grown for the church, for beauty and for a genuine medicinal use of the bulb in poultices. Trees are planted now, and cuttings of the woody things are taken now, hardwood lengths of a finger's thickness, pushed into a sheltered trench with only the top showing, left to root over the winter with no attention at all. And that is the last of it. The gardener straightens up in the near dark at the end of a November afternoon, with the beds turned and rough, and the wall mended, and the garlic in, and there is nothing left that must be done before spring. We turn now to December, and to a garden that has almost nothing left to give and is asked for something anyway. The beds are bare or brown. The light is at its shortest. The ground is either frozen or too wet to walk on. And yet December is one of the busier months in the store, because December is when people begin to be ill. Let us turn now to what the winter actually did to a medieval community, because it is the reason the loft was filled in the first place. The cold came into the buildings. A monastery church in December was a very cold place indeed, unheated, stone-floored, entered several times in the night, and the brothers stood and knelt in it for hours. The dormitory was not much better. In most houses there was a single room where a fire was permitted during the day, and everywhere else was the temperature of the outside air with the wind taken off it. The result, entirely predictably, was a season of coughs, of chest complaints, of streaming colds, of aching joints, and of chilblains. That painful swelling of fingers and toes that comes from cold and returns every year to the same people. And so the infirmary cupboard is opened, and what comes out of it is the summer. We turn now to the winter remedies, one by one, because this is where all the gathering finally pays. For the chest, elecampane above all, that thick root lifted in October, boiled down into a decoction or candied into a sweet lozenge with honey, given for coughs and for hard breathing. Alongside it, hyssop, which appears in the old texts constantly for the chest, and which holds its scent well in the dried state. Horehound, bitter and grey, and one of the most persistent cough remedies in the whole of European practice, still sold in sweet form long after almost everything else in this list had been forgotten. Thyme, licorice where it could be had, for the sore throat, marshmallow root, slippery and soothing, and a syrup of violets from the spring, and honey in almost every form. For the fever, the cooling things, and above all the willow bark from the trees down by the water, which was chewed and boiled and given for pain and for fever for a very long time before anybody understood why it helped. For the aching joints of the old brothers, warming rubs of infused oil, poultices of comfrey and of mustard, and the flannels wrung out hot and laid on. For the chilblains, salves of fat and beeswax with whatever was thought to help, and the sound advice, given then as now, and just as widely ignored, to warm the hands slowly rather than thrusting them at the fire, and for everyone, through the whole of the dark, the warm, sweet drinks, honey and hot water, all warmed with spices, thin gruels, almond milk, the simple business of giving a cold person something hot to hold, which is medicine of a kind that requires no theory at all. Let us turn now to the greenery, which is the one thing the garden still produces in December. There is a very old habit in Northern Europe of bringing evergreen into the house in the dead of winter, and the church absorbed it thoroughly. Holly, ivy, bay, box, yew and rosemary were cut and carried in, and by the later medieval centuries the decking of churches and halls with greenery at Christmas was entirely standard and appears in accounts, in carols, and in complaints from those who thought it excessive. So the gardener goes out with the billhook in the 3rd week of Advent and cuts holly from the hedge, chosen for berries where he can find it, and holly is one of the few plants in the whole year that he must be careful about cutting too early, because a holly branch brought in warm sheds its leaves within days. Ivy from the wall, long strands of it, and the pairing of holly and ivy in the old songs is so persistent that it is clearly older than any of the songs. Bay from the bush by the warm wall, which is a plant of the church and of the kitchen and of the crown all at once, and which is cut sparingly because a bay is slow. Rosemary, if he has any that has survived. And rosemary in a cold winter is precious enough that only a few sprigs go. They go up to the sacrist, along with the last of the year's beeswax candles, and the church is dressed. And for a fortnight the building smells faintly of a hedge. We turn now to the store, which is checked over now in a way it is not checked at any other time. He goes up the ladder into the loft, which is a different place now than it was in July. The bundles have finished drying and hang still. The air is cold and dry, and the smell has settled into something quieter and dustier. He takes down what has dried and been forgotten, strips it and pots it, and he goes through everything for the 2 problems. Damp, which shows as a dulling and a limpness, and, in a bad case, as a bloom of mold in the middle of a bundle, and vermin, which show as chewed stems, as droppings on the boards, and as the particular site of a pot that has been got into. Whatever has spoiled goes on the heap, and there is always some, and a good year is one where there is not much. What remains is portioned. Some goes down to the infirmary cupboard for immediate use. Some stays in the loft as reserve, and a little of certain things is set aside untouched. Because a gardener who uses the whole of a scarce herb in December has nothing at all if there is an outbreak of something in February. Let us turn now to the roots in the sand, which come out now. The boxes in the cool store are opened, and the roots laid in them in October come out as fresh as the day they went in, or nearly so. Elecampane, marshmallow, angelica, and the kitchen's carrots and turnips and parsnips alongside them. There is something quietly satisfying about this, that anyone who has ever stored anything will recognize. The plant is dead, the ground is frozen, the year is over, and yet here in a wooden box in a cold dark room is a perfectly good root in December, because somebody thought ahead in October. We turn now to the bees, whom we left in April and who have been working all summer without any further mention. They are in the skeps against the south wall, and they are alive in there, though nothing about the outside of a straw hive in December suggests it. Inside, the colony has drawn itself into a tight ball around the queen, and the bees on the outside of that ball shiver their flight muscles to make heat, and the ball rotates slowly so that no bee stays on the cold outside for too long. They eat their way slowly upward through the stores as the winter goes on. The keeper cannot open a skep in December and would not want to. What he can do is heft it, which is exactly what it sounds like, tilting the hive slightly from the back to feel the weight of it. A heavy skep has stores. A light one does not, and a light skep in December is a colony that will starve in February. Beyond that there is only protection, The skeps are given their winter covers, cones of thatched straw called hackles in some regions, tied over the top against the rain. The entrance is narrowed against mice, which will move into a hive in cold weather and do a great deal of damage. And the row is checked after every gale. The honey taken in the autumn is already in the store, and it is not only sweetness. It is the base of half the winter medicine, the preservative for the syrups, and the thing that makes a bitter decoction possible to swallow. And the wax is already candles, and the candles are already burning on the altar through the longest nights of the year, so that light in a medieval church in December is, quite literally, a product of the garden. We turn now to the shortest day and to the turning. The solstice falls a few days before Christmas, and although the medieval calendar reckoned it slightly differently than we do, the fact of it was watched everywhere. The feast of Saint Lucy on the 13th of December carried a strong association with light and with the shortest day in the older reckoning, and it is remembered in the north to this day with candles. And then the days begin to lengthen, by a minute or two at first, so slightly that it cannot be felt for weeks. The gardener knows the date and takes note of it, and expects nothing from it for a month. We turn now to the kitchen, which in December wants the garden almost as much as the infirmary does. A medieval winter kitchen worked with a narrow set of ingredients: salted and smoked meat from the Mortimer slaughter, salt fish in enormous quantities, because the fast days of the church calendar were numerous and a religious house observed most of them, dried peas and beans, stored roots, bread, owl. Every one of those things is improved, and in the case of the salt fish very substantially improved, by seasoning, and the seasoning came out of the loft. So the cook sends down for dried savory, and thyme and marjoram, for bay leaves, for mustard seed which was ground with vinegar into the sharp paste that medieval eaters put on nearly everything, for fennel and dill seed, for parsley, for sage which went with pork wherever pork was eaten, for onions and garlic and leeks from the store. And at the great feast itself, whatever the house could afford of the bought spices came out of the locked chest, because pepper and ginger and cinnamon and cloves and mace and saffron were the mark of a feast day, and were used with a heaviness that a modern palate would find odd. The line between the kitchen store and the medicine store, which we have been treating as a real boundary all night, is at its very thinnest here. The same fennel seed sweetened a fish sauce and settled a stomach. The same sage went into the pot and into a gargle. The infirmary and the cook were drawing on the same loft, and in a smaller house they were very likely drawing on it in the same afternoon. Let us turn now to Christmas itself, and to what it meant in a working year. The 12 days from Christmas to Epiphany were, in a great many places, the longest continuous stretch of the year in which ordinary work was set aside. The fields could not be worked in any case. The house ate what it had. The offices were sung with more ceremony and more light than at any other season, and the church stood decked in the greenery the gardener cut. For him, this is close to a fortnight in which there is genuinely nothing to do outdoors, and it is the only such fortnight in the whole 12 months. He is not idle. Nobody in a monastery was permitted to be idle, but the work is indoor work, and it is the mending and the sorting and the reading that we described in January, which is where this whole year began. and that is the shape of it. The year closes, not with a harvest or a celebration in the garden, but with a man sitting in a workshop in the dark with a bundle of hazel rods and a knife, making next year's hurdles while the bells go for the night office. We turn now, at the last, to the morning we began with. It is January again. The frost is on the shaded side of every bed, and will not lift there today. The low door opens inward against the drift. The paths are hard. The beds are exactly as we found them, some bare and rough, some grey-green and sullen, some gone entirely underground. 12 months have passed, and the garden looks the same. Let us turn now to what did change, because a garden that looks unchanged has changed a great deal. The rosemary by the warm wall did not come through. It stood green until the middle of January, and then went grey, and by March it was plainly dead, and it was dug out and burned, and the bed given to savoury instead. The gardener will try rosemary again, in a more sheltered corner, from a cutting begged elsewhere, and he may lose that one too. One bed was given over entirely to a plant that was not there last year, grown from a bag of seed that arrived with a brother from another house, and it did poorly, and it may do better next year now that he understands it wants more sun than he gave it. The mint bed was divided and replanted, and is now clean and vigorous where it was thin and exhausted. The wall was mended in 2 places, and the gate was rehung. 3 of the wattle edges were replaced entirely, and the seed chest, opened this morning, has in it a slightly different set of things than it had a year ago. 2 seeds he had are gone, because he did not manage to save them, and the old stock is dead. 3 seeds he did not have are there. None of this is visible from the gate. All of it is the year. We turn now to the man himself, and to the honest limit of what we can say about him. We do not know his name. We do not know his face or his age, or where he came from, or whether he was good at his work. Individual monastic gardeners almost never appear by name in the records, because gardening is not the kind of thing that gets a man written about. What we have instead are the plans, the account rolls, the inventories, the herbals, the archaeology of the beds themselves, and the poem of one 9th century monk who happened to be both a gardener and a writer. And out of those we can build a composite that is true in every particular and belongs to no single person. That is worth being clear about at the end of a long night. The garden we have walked through is real, in the sense that every bed, every tool, every practice, and every plant in it is attested. The man is a reasonable inference standing in for several hundred men whose names are gone. Let us turn now to the succession, which is the last thing to say about this place. He is not the first gardener here. The beds were laid out before he came, by somebody who chose where the paths would run and how wide the beds would be, and that person is as anonymous as he is. The wall is older than the beds. Some of the plants are older than the wall, and he will not be the last. At some point he will become too old for the digging, and a younger brother will be given the charge, and he will spend a year or 2 walking the paths with him and showing him things, and the showing will be exactly the same kind of teaching that a village mother gave a daughter, done by hand and by pointing rather than by book. Then he will die and be buried in the orchard among the apple trees, in the arrangement that the old plan of St. Gall drew so plainly, with the graves and the trees in the same ground. and the garden will go on. The comfrey will come up. The rue will hold its leaves through the winter. The mint will push under the edging boards into the path, and somebody will go along that edge with a knife in March, exactly as he did, for a reason nobody will need to explain. Let us turn now to how we know any of this at all, since almost none of it was written down by the people doing it. Some of it comes from plans and pictures. The great parchment plan of St. Gall, with its 16 labelled beds. The illustrations in manuscripts of men digging, watering with a thumb pot, grafting a tree, kneeling to weed. Later paintings of walled gardens with raised beds and turf seats and trellised roses, which are idealized but which were painted by people who had seen the real thing. Some comes from accounts. The rolls of a large monastery record what was bought and what was paid for, and a gardener's expenses appear in them, seed and tools and hired labor and the mending of a wall, in the driest possible form and with complete reliability. Some comes from the books, the herbals and regimens and remedy collections that tell us what people believed the plants would do, and a surprising amount comes out of the ground. Archaeologists excavating monastic sites have found the beds themselves, the dark lines of the paths, the post holes of the edging, the pits and drains and water channels. They have found the tools, preserved in waterlogged deposits where iron and wood survive. They have found the watering pots, and they have found, in the soil samples taken from those layers, the seeds and pollen of the plants that were actually growing there, which is the closest thing we will ever have to a photograph of a medieval bed. Put all of that together, and a picture emerges that is detailed and consistent and, in its ordinary daily texture, remarkably close to what we have walked through tonight. We turn now to what became of these gardens, because they did not simply stop. In the countries where the religious houses were dissolved in the 16th century, a great many Physic gardens were lost outright, the walls robbed for stone, and the beds ploughed, and the plants going wild in the rubble. Some of what grew in them survived as escapes and can still be found on the sites of old abbeys, and there are plants in Britain today whose distribution maps look uncannily like a map of medieval monastic houses. But the idea did not die with the buildings. It moved. In the 16th century, the first true botanic gardens were founded at universities in Italy, at Pisa and at Padua, laid out explicitly to grow the plants that medical students needed to recognize. Others followed across Europe. And the garden founded in Oxford in the earlier 17th century, and the one made at Chelsea for the apothecaries of London later in the same century, are the direct descendants of exactly the arrangement we have been standing in. They are laid out in beds. Each bed holds one kind of plant. Everything is labelled so that there can be no mistake about what a thing is. Which is, when you set it beside the plan of St. Gall, very nearly the same garden, 800 years later, made for the same reason. And a few of them are still standing after a fashion. There are monastic sites in Britain and on the continent where the walls of the garden survive to knee height, and the lines of the beds can be walked. And there are modern gardens planted inside those walls to the old plan, using the old plant lists, which are as close as anybody now living will come to standing where we have stood tonight. We turn now to the plainest fact in all of this, which is how ordinary it was. There was nothing exceptional about this garden. There were hundreds of them, across every part of Europe, where there were religious houses and thousands of gardeners keeping them. And the great majority of those men did the same jobs in the same order, in the same months for their whole working lives, without any sense that they were doing something that would still be described 1,000 years later. They were simply growing what the sick needed in the ground they had, with the tools they had, one season at a time. And when you set the whole of it out end to end, as we have tonight, from the frost on the first morning to the frost on the last, what emerges is not a story with a shape. It is a circle, the same tasks, the same beds, the same feasts, the same seed chest, coming round and round, each turn slightly different from the last, and almost identical to it. That is what a year in a Physic garden actually was. Not a journey with a destination, but a wheel that somebody kept turning, quietly, for a very long time. And so we come to the end of the year, and to the end of our evening together. We have gone all the way round. We came in through a low door on a frozen morning, and found the beds asleep, and we watched the iron sharpened in February, and the seed go into the ground in March by the reckoning of the saints, and the green come up in April, and the whole garden close over in May. We stood in the rose bed in June, with a shallow basket, and sat by a slow fire in the still house, watching a drip that could not be hurried, and climbed the ladder into a loft in July that smelled of everything at once. We carried baskets all through August and followed the path to the infirmary door to see where it all went. We saved the seed in September and lifted the roots in October, and read the old books in the dark evenings, and fed the ground in November, and cut the greenery in December. And then we stood at the gate again on the same cold morning, 12 months on, in a garden that looked exactly as it had. That is the whole of it. There is nothing else to know, and nothing at all to remember. The frost is on the shaded side of the beds. The seed chest is shut. The loft above the workshop is quiet, and the bundles hanging in it have long since stopped rustling. The bees are drawn into their tight warm ball behind the straw. The door is closed on its worn latch, and the wall is holding the wind off an empty garden, exactly as it was built to do, and it will go on doing that whether anyone is watching or not. There is nothing left for you to do tonight either. No bed to weed, no water to carry, no hour to keep. Let your shoulders go heavy. Let your hands unclose. Let the whole slow turning year we have walked through settle down somewhere behind you and stay there, and let yourself go the rest of the way into sleep, unhurried, the way everything in that garden did everything. Sleep well. The quiet apothecary will be back soon with another quiet chapter. The last light goes off the top of the wall, and the beds go grey, and then dark. Somewhere beyond the gate the frost is settling into the ground for the night, and the garden, patient as it has always been, waits quietly for the spring.